Ark Raiders has been quietly building one of the most detailed and genuinely fascinating lore universes in recent gaming memory. And in this video, I am going to walk you through every piece of it, updated as of March 2026. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So here is the thing about Ark Raiders and its lore. The game does not have cutscenes explaining everything to you. It does not have a codex menu you can open up to read through the history of the world. The story is built from pieces, from loading screen text, from notes found on dead bodies, from the things characters say while you're running across a field, from the design of the machines themselves and the way they move and what they carry. I spent a long time going through all of that, and when I sat down to put this video together, I made a deliberate choice. I decided to build the narrative outward from the Ark themselves, not inward from the human side of things. That means the backstories of the Nexus factions take a backseat here, not because they do not matter, but because I think the machines are the real center of the story. Everything else orbits around them. That is the lens through which this video was made. What you are about to hear is my interpretation of the evidence, assembled from the fragments the game gives us. Chapter 1. The World Before the Ark, Earth Before the Fall. To understand what Ark Raiders is really about, you have to start somewhere that the game itself barely touches on. You have to start with the world before the machines came. The game gives us glimpses of this period, scattered references in found documents and in the way the ruins look and the way characters talk about things they used to have. And those glimpses paint a picture of a world that was recognizable, a world that was ours or close enough to ours that it stings when you look at what became of it. The Earth of Ark Raiders was not a utopia in the period before the Ark's arrival. The documents and environmental clues suggest a world still wrestling with the same fundamental problems that define our own era. There were resource conflicts, there were social divisions, there was political tension across different regions and power structures. The lore does not idealize the old world. In fact, one possible reading of the found materials suggests that some of the systems and technologies that existed before the fall were already straining under their own contradictions. What the pre-fall world does seem to have had, at least to a meaningful degree, is a functioning technological civilization. There is evidence in the ruins of what the surface was before the Ark came. The architecture of abandoned buildings, the kinds of vehicles left behind, the tools and equipment raiders find while scavenging, all of it points toward a society with sophisticated infrastructure. Not science fiction level technology in every sense, but a world that had made significant progress in automation, communication, and manufacturing. The automation piece is interesting because it becomes darkly relevant later. The lore of Ark Raiders hints, and I want to emphasize that word hints, that humanity in the years before the fall had been developing increasingly capable autonomous systems. Automated manufacturing, automated logistics, automated defense systems. The surface of what was once a thriving civilization is littered with the remnants of machines that humans built. And then there are the other machines, the ones that came from outside. And the game seems to be asking, very quietly, whether the line between those two categories is as clear as we assume. The period immediately before the Ark's arrival is where the lore gets genuinely interesting. From what the game's documents suggest, there were warnings, not necessarily about the Ark specifically, but about anomalies, about things that did not fit the expected patterns of space observation and communication monitoring. The people who would have been paying attention to those signals, scientists, military observers, certain government agencies, may have had some awareness that something was changing. But the lore suggests this awareness was fragmented, compartmentalized, possibly suppressed in some cases. One of the things that makes Ark Raiders lore compelling is the way it refuses to give you a clean timeline. You're piecing things together from documents written by people who were in the middle of events, people who did not know what was coming next, people who were scared or confused or in denial. A note written by a logistics manager 3 weeks before the fall might be sitting next to a note written by a soldier 2 years after. You are reading them out of order, the same way archaeologists read the past, and you have to build the chronology yourself. What that chronology suggests, when you try to assemble it, is that the world before the fall was moving fast. Technology was advancing, populations were concentrated in urban centres, global supply chains connected everything, and all of that interconnection, all of that density and dependency made the civilization extraordinarily vulnerable to a shock that it had no framework to process. The found documents from this period tend to focus on ordinary things: supply orders, maintenance logs, personal letters, work schedules. This is not an accident. The game uses the mundanity of the old world to make the contrast with the present more powerful. When you read someone complaining about a delayed shipment in a note dated from what seems to be the pre-fall period, and then you look up from that note at the burned-out wreckage of whatever building you're standing in, the weight of what happened lands differently than if the note had been full of dramatic warnings. The infrastructure of the old world is visible in the bones of the surface zones. The industrial facilities, the transportation networks, the urban layouts. These are not random. They reflect a civilization that had organized itself around efficiency, around the movement of goods and people and information. And when you look at what the Ark machines do on the surface, the way they move through those old systems, the way they harvest specific materials from specific places, you start to wonder if they were designed knowing exactly what they would find here. That is a theory we will come back to. But for now, what matters is understanding what was lost. Because Ark Raiders is at its core a story about loss. The loss of a world, the loss of a way of life. And the game earns that emotional weight by spending time, however brief and fragmented, showing you what that world looked like before the machines took it apart. The population of Earth before the fall is something the game references but never quantifies precisely. What the lore does tell us, through the scale of the ruins, through the references in documents, through the sheer density of the abandoned infrastructure on the surface, is that this was a large, complex, globally connected civilization. Cities that housed millions of people, industries that employed tens of thousands, communications networks that spanned continents, and all of that, the people, the cities, the networks, was fundamentally transformed in a period of time that the lore suggests was horrifyingly short. The fall did not take decades. It did not happen the way civilizations have historically declined, slowly enough that people could adapt, migrate, rebuild elsewhere. The Ark's arrival was fast, and what follows from that is something the game explores through its survivors, people who did not have time to say goodbye to the world they knew. The social structures of the pre-fall world are visible in the class distinctions and hierarchies that exist inside Nexus today. The game suggests that when people went underground, they brought their hierarchies with them. The people who had resources and connections before the fall had advantages in securing places in Nexus and in establishing positions of influence there. This is never stated bluntly in the lore, but it is implied through character backgrounds and through the way power is distributed in the underground city. Technology companies, or their remnants, appear to have played a significant role in the pre-fall world. There are references in the lore to corporate entities and private contractors that were involved in infrastructure, in communications, possibly in the early autonomous systems that were being developed before the Ark arrived. Some of those organizational structures seem to have survived the fall in some form, existing now as factions or interest groups within Nexus. One of the more melancholy aspects of the pre-fall world, based on the lore fragments available, is how normal it was in the days immediately before the end. People were going to work, People were arguing about politics. People were making plans for the future. The catastrophic scale of what was coming was invisible to most of them. And that invisibility, that ordinariness of the last days of the old world, is something the game uses to make the world feel real. Agriculture is something the lore touches on in its references to surface zones. The areas Raiders explore include what appear to have been farming regions, rural areas that were once productive parts of the food supply chain. Seeing those areas now, overgrown or stripped by Ark machines, gives you a sense of how total the disruption was. The systems that fed billions of people did not just stop working. They were physically altered by the arrival and activity of the machines. The environment before the fall was already showing signs of stress, according to some of the documents. This is not a major theme in the lore, but it is present. References to weather patterns, to resource scarcity in certain regions, to discussions about sustainability and long-term planning. The world was not in crisis in the way that the fall would create crisis, but it was not in perfect equilibrium either. This detail may or may not be significant to the larger story of the Ark's arrival. Energy infrastructure is one of the things you can trace through the ruins on the surface. Power plants, substations, transmission lines, all of it visible in the environmental design of the surface zones. The Ark machines interact with this infrastructure in specific ways, which is something the lore points to when discussing what the machines are harvesting and processing. Energy systems that humans built for human purposes seem to interest the Ark, though the exact nature of that interest is one of the central mysteries of the game's story. Communications technology is something the lore references in the context of what was lost during the fall. The collapse of global communication networks was one of the first signs that something was catastrophically wrong. Before people understood what the Ark was or what it was doing, they understood that signals were going dark. Satellites stopped responding. Long-range communications became unreliable and then impossible. This information blackout in the early days of the fall is a significant element of the story, because it explains why the response to the Ark was so fragmented and ineffective. Military infrastructure on the surface tells its own story through the ruins. There are locations in the surface zones that appear to have been defensive positions, fortifications, areas where organized resistance was attempted. The evidence suggests that these efforts were not completely ineffective immediately, but that they were ultimately overwhelmed. The scale and persistence of the Ark's machines, and the speed with which they adapted to human tactics, made conventional military response increasingly futile. The scientific community of the pre-fall world is another element that the lore touches on, with interesting implications. There seem to have been ongoing efforts to understand the Ark from the moment the machines appeared, even as the broader population and the military were focused on survival and resistance. Scientists trying to analyze machine fragments, to decode transmission patterns, to understand the purpose behind the Ark's behavior. Some of those efforts may have produced knowledge that eventually found its way to Nexus. Children who were born in the final years before the fall would now be young adults in the world of Ark Raiders. This is a demographic detail that the game seems aware of, given that several characters appear to be in the age range of people who would have been very young when the fall happened, or possibly born after it. These individuals have a fundamentally different relationship to the old world than those who remember it. For them, the ruins are just the ruins. The old world is something they know only through stories. Education in the old world is referenced through the kinds of literacy and technical knowledge that surface in character backgrounds. The people of Nexus include individuals with specialized skills, engineering knowledge, medical training, scientific backgrounds, all of which trace back to educational systems that existed before the fall. The preservation of that knowledge, through people rather than through institutions, is one of the ways that humanity has maintained its capacity to function. Trade and commerce in the Old World are visible through the commercial infrastructure of the surface zones. Warehouses, distribution centres, retail spaces, all of it tells a story of a civilization organised around the movement and sale of goods. The raiders who scavenge this infrastructure are, in a way, the last participants in that old economy, extracting value from its ruins long after the systems that created it have been destroyed. Medical technology and healthcare are visible in the ruins through hospital facilities and pharmaceutical manufacturing infrastructure. The found documents include medical records, supply manifests, research notes. This infrastructure, which would have supported the health of millions of people, is now stripped and decaying. The loss of large-scale healthcare capability is one of the things that shapes life in Nexus, where medical resources are precious and the ability to treat serious injuries is limited by supply constraints. Transportation networks on the surface, roads, rail systems, what appear to have been logistics hubs, are visible in the environmental design of the zones raiders explore. These networks were built to move people and goods efficiently across vast distances. The Ark machines now move through these same networks, using them for their own purposes. There is something unsettling about watching a machine designed to destroy navigate a road that was designed to connect. The cultural life of the old world surfaces occasionally in the found materials. Books, recordings, fragments of entertainment media, personal mementos. These objects, encountered on the surface or referenced in documents, give you a sense of the richness of the culture that was lost. The game does not dwell on this, but it uses these details to give the old world a texture and humanity that makes its loss feel real rather than abstract. Urban planning and architecture are visible in the structure of the surface zones. The cities of the old world, or what remains of them, were designed for human use, for comfort and efficiency and community. The contrast between those intentions and the current state of those spaces, occupied by machines that have no use for human comfort, is one of the quieter visual arguments the game makes about the nature of the Ark's impact. Water infrastructure, treatment plants, pumping stations, distribution systems appears in the surface zones and in found documents. The Ark's activity has affected these systems in ways that have long-term implications for any humans who might want to live on the surface again. This is a detail that the lore uses to reinforce the totality of the Ark's disruption, not just the immediate destruction of the fall, but the degradation of the systems that make long-term human habitation possible. Manufacturing and industrial production left a significant mark on the surface landscape. Factories, processing plants, industrial parks, all of it visible in the zones raiders explore. The Ark machines have a particular interest in industrial sites, which the lore suggests is connected to the materials and energy available there. This interest is not random, which points toward the Ark having specific objectives in their harvesting activity. Research facilities and laboratories appear in the surface zones and in the found documents. Pre-fall scientific research was broad and ambitious, covering fields from materials, science to biology to advanced computing. Some of this research was ongoing right up to the fall. Notes from researchers, experiment logs, project documentation, all of it abandoned mid-process when the machines arrived. What some of that research was exploring, and whether it has any relevance to the Ark, is a thread the lore leaves deliberately open. The social contract of the old world, the agreements and assumptions that governed how people lived together, was shattered by the fall. The found documents that come from the immediate post-arrival period show this happening in real time. People abandoning agreements, abandoning obligations, making desperate decisions driven by immediate survival. The chaos of the early fall period is visible in the inconsistencies and contradictions in the found materials from that time. Political leadership in the old world is referenced in documents that discuss emergency measures, evacuation orders, resource allocation decisions. The people making those decisions are visible through their memos and orders, though not always sympathetically. The law suggests that institutional responses to the Ark's arrival were often too slow, too limited, too focused on managing information rather than managing the actual crisis. The internet and digital communications infrastructure left traces in the world even after the networks went dark. Servers, hardware, data centers, all of it visible in the ruins. Some of this hardware seems to have been modified or interacted with by Ark machines, which is a detail that the law points toward without fully explaining. Whether the Ark was accessing digital information from human systems is something the game leaves as an open question. Personal finance and economic systems are visible in found documents through references to transactions, accounts, contracts. The collapse of these systems during the fall is implied by the way characters in the present talk about value. What has value now? What was valuable then? The transition from a money economy to one based on salvage and barter and allocation by authority in Nexus is one of the ways the law shows how, fundamentally, the fall changed the rules of human life. Family structures and social relationships in the old world are visible through personal documents, letters, photographs, notes. These are among the most emotionally resonant found items in the game because they are about individual people and their individual relationships, not about institutions or systems. They remind you that the world that was lost was not an abstraction. It was the world where specific people loved specific other people, and those relationships were ended or permanently altered by the arrival of the machines. The legal systems of the old world, courts, contracts, property rights, all of it, collapsed during the fall and has not been reconstructed in any formal sense. Nexus has its own rules, but they are not the laws of the old world. This legal vacuum is one of the things that shapes the raider profession. The surface is, in a legal sense, unclaimed, or at least governed only by whatever authority Nexus can project, which is limited. This creates both opportunity and danger. Faith and religion in the old world are referenced occasionally in the found materials. Personal religious items, notes with spiritual content, references to religious institutions. The game does not make organized religion a central element of the current world's politics, but it acknowledges that belief was part of the old world's texture. Whether any of those belief systems persist in meaningful form in Nexus is something the lore leaves mostly unexplored. The natural world before the fall was already changed by human activity, but it was present. Wildlife, vegetation, natural water systems, all of it existed alongside human civilization in whatever balance was possible. The Ark's arrival disrupted that balance in ways that are visible on the surface. Some areas have been stripped or altered beyond recognition. Others have been reclaimed by nature in the absence of human activity. The surface is a complicated ecological picture. Children's lives in the old world are glimpsed through found materials that reference schools, toys, family spaces. The loss of a normal childhood is something that the lore implies for the generation that grew up in the early years after the fall, both in whatever temporary shelters existed before Nexus was established, and in the constrained environment of Nexus itself. Characters who are adults in the current story may have had their childhoods radically altered by the fall. Labour and work in the old world are visible through the sheer variety of industrial and commercial infrastructure on the surface. Mines, factories, offices, service facilities, all of it built by people who were doing their jobs, who had occupations and schedules and professional identities. The transition from a world of specialised labour to the survival economy of Nexus, where everyone contributes to collective survival, is one of the ways the fall fundamentally restructured human social organisation. The last day of the old world, whatever that day was, is something the lore approaches but never definitively dates. Found materials from the immediate pre-fall period suggests that the transition was not instantaneous globally. Different areas may have experienced the Ark's arrival and the disruption it caused at different times, with some regions having slightly more warning than others. But the overall timeline was compressed into a period that historical civilizations would have considered impossibly brief for such a total transformation. Memory and nostalgia for the old world are visible in how characters talk and in the objects they carry. References to things they miss, things they used to have, things they wish their children could experience. This nostalgia is not idealized in the lore. Characters do not pretend the old world was perfect, but it is real. The emotional weight of knowing that a world existed and was taken is one of the defining feelings of life in the present. Hope in the pre-fall world was oriented toward progress, toward the future that humanity was building. Scientists working on new technologies, planners designing better cities, people raising children and investing in what those children would inherit. That forward orientation was not just interrupted by the fall, it was inverted. The world of Ark Raiders is one where the future is uncertain in a way that the old world, for all its problems, generally was not. The last chapter of the old world's story, from the moment the Ark arrived to the moment that Nexus became the defining reality for the survivors, is a story that the game reconstructs only partially. But the fragments are enough to understand the weight of it. Enough to understand why the people of Nexus carry what they carry, why the Raiders do what they do, and why the machines that took the world have become such a consuming obsession for everyone who survived. Because you do not forget a thing that cost you everything. Chapter 2, First Contact, the day the machines arrived. The arrival of the Ark is the event that everything in Ark Raiders orbits around. It is the dividing line between the before and the after. And yet, for all its centrality to the story, the game gives you this moment, in fragments, in second-hand accounts, and incomplete records and physical evidence that you have to interpret. The full picture of what First Contact looked like is something you have to piece together, and what you find when you do is a sequence of events that is both simpler and stranger than you might expect. The first indicators that something was coming seem to have come from orbital observation. The lore suggests, without being explicit about it, that there were anomalies detected above Earth's atmosphere before any Ark machines actually reached the surface. These anomalies might have been dismissed or downgraded as non-threatening by whoever was responsible for evaluating them, or they might have been understood to be significant and the information suppressed or poorly communicated. The found materials are ambiguous on this point, and that ambiguity feels deliberate. What the lore is clearer about is that when Ark machines actually began descending, it happened faster than any coordinated response could address. The first wave of the Ark's arrival seems to have been characterized by speed and scale, rather than by any preliminary communication or warning that could have been understood. There was no first contact in the sense of an exchange. There was simply the beginning of something that nobody was equipped to respond to. The physical experience of the Ark's arrival, as reconstructed from found documents and survivor accounts referenced in the lore, sounds overwhelming, not just in the military sense, but in a sensory and psychological sense. The machines were unlike anything that had been prepared for. They did not match the frameworks that people had for thinking about threats. They were not an army in any conventional sense. They were something else entirely, and the inability to categorize them may have paralyzed effective responses in those critical early hours and days. The initial descent pattern of the Ark, based on what the lore suggests about the early distribution of machine activity, was not random. Specific areas were targeted or at least heavily concentrated with Ark activity from early on. This points toward the machines having prior information about Earth's surface, which is itself a significant implication. Either they gathered that information during the approach, or they had it before they arrived. Both possibilities are disturbing in different ways. The sounds associated with the Ark's arrival are referenced in personal accounts embedded in the found materials. Characters who were alive during this period, who witnessed the early fall, describe sounds that were new and alien and that carried with them an instinctive sense of wrongness. The machines make sounds, the grinding and humming and mechanical noise of their operation, and those sounds arriving in familiar environments created a cognitive dissonance that seems to have contributed to the psychological impact of the early fall. Military response to the first wave of Ark descent was, by the evidence available in the lore, initially forceful. There were attempts to engage the machines with conventional weapons. The results of those early engagements are implied by the military equipment you find abandoned in the ruins of the surface, by the fortifications that were clearly never completed, by defensive positions that show signs of having been established and then overrun. The early military response was not nothing, but it was not enough. The communication breakdown that accompanied the Ark's arrival is one of the most significant aspects of the early fall period. As Ark machines interacted with or destroyed communications infrastructure, the ability of human institutions to coordinate their responses collapsed rapidly. Military units lost contact with command structures. Civilian emergency services lost the ability to communicate with each other. What might have been manageable as a coordinated global response became a fragmented series of local crises, each addressed in isolation and therefore addressed inadequately. Civilian evacuation during the early fall is visible in the surface zones through the evidence of hasty departures. Vehicles left on roads, possessions abandoned in the middle of packing, the physical evidence of people who left in a hurry or who were interrupted in the process of leaving. The evacuation of civilian populations was never complete, never organized on the scale that would have been needed, and the law implies that many people who tried to evacuate were unable to reach safety. The underground facilities that would eventually form the basis of Nexus existed before the fall, in some form. This is implied by the scale and sophistication of Nexus as a functioning city, which could not have been built entirely in the chaos of the fall itself. Some of what became Nexus was pre-existing infrastructure, bunkers, underground facilities, deep civil defense structures. The transition of those spaces into a permanent human habitation was something that happened during and after the fall, not before it. The people who made it to safety in the early days of the fall were not necessarily the most deserving or the most capable. The lore, through character backgrounds and found materials, suggests that access to underground safety was often determined by proximity, by existing connections to the facilities, by luck, and yes, by social and economic position. This is a detail that shapes the social dynamics of Nexus in ways that are still felt in the game's present. The Ark machines in the early days of the fall seem to have been primarily focused on the surface. They were not systematically hunting humans underground, at least not initially. Whether this was because they were unaware of the underground facilities or because the underground was not relevant to their primary objectives is something the lore does not definitively answer. But the fact that Nexus exists at all suggests that the Ark, whatever their capabilities, either could not or chose not to eliminate humanity entirely. The first human deaths attributed to Ark machine activity are not memorialized in any specific way in the lore, but their weight is present in the way characters and documents reference the early fall. The shock of people being killed by machines that had come from space, the incomprehensibility of that event for anyone living through it, is something you feel in the emotional register of the found materials from that period. Emergency broadcasts from governments and authorities during the early fall are referenced in found materials. These broadcasts, pieced together from what the lore suggests, were a mix of reassurance that became increasingly hollow, practical instructions that quickly became outdated, and eventually silence as the broadcasting infrastructure itself was destroyed or abandoned. The arc of those communications from authority to silence mirrors the arc of the institutional world itself. Scientific observation of the early Ark machines was attempted, based on found documents that appear to come from researchers trying to analyze what they were seeing. These early observations were made under extraordinary pressure by people who were simultaneously trying to survive and trying to understand. The results of those observations, the early theories about what the Ark was and what it was doing, formed the foundation of the knowledge base that eventually made its way to Nexus. The psychological impact of first contact on the survivors is something the game explores through its characters. People who were alive when the machines arrived carry a specific kind of trauma that is different from the trauma of those who grew up entirely in the post-fall world. They remember a before. They carry the weight of comparison. The world they live in now is measured against the world they lost, and that measurement is one that the current world consistently fails. The machines themselves, in those first days of the fall, were observed to have a specific behavioral pattern. They were not indiscriminately destructive. They seemed to have priorities. Certain kinds of infrastructure were targeted. Certain kinds of resources were harvested or processed. This selectivity was noted by observers from the beginning and is one of the key pieces of evidence that points toward the Ark. Having an agenda rather than simply being a destructive force, communication attempts toward the Ark in the early days of the fall are referenced in some found materials. Whether these attempts were official or unofficial, whether they were coordinated or improvised, they seem to have produced no response that anyone could interpret as meaningful. The Ark machines did not communicate with humans, did not acknowledge attempts at contact, did not change their behavior in response to signals that were clearly intentional. This non-response is itself a statement that the law encourages you to think about. The physical size and variety of Ark machines encountered in the early fall appears to have surprised observers. The range from small scout units to large heavy machines suggested a hierarchical or modular system, not a homogeneous force. This diversity implied organization and planning, implied that whoever or whatever had designed the Ark had thought carefully about the range of tasks the machines would need to perform. That implication of deliberate design is one of the threads the lore pulls on throughout the story. Casualties in the early fall were catastrophic. The lore does not give you specific numbers, which may be because specific numbers would be impossible to verify or because the game wants to preserve a sense of scale without reducing it to a statistic. But the scale of what was lost is visible in the ruins, in the empty cities, in the absence of the civilization that should be there. The numbers implied by that absence are staggering. The decision to go underground was not made once by a central authority. It was made thousands of times by thousands of groups in thousands of locations, each one a local calculation of risk and available options. Some groups who went underground survived to eventually reach or become part of Nexus. Others did not. The found materials include evidence of underground facilities that were established but did not sustain, where survivors did not make it for whatever combination of reasons. The first winter after the Ark's arrival is referenced in the lore as a particularly brutal period. Whether this is because of direct effects of Ark activity on the environment, or simply because of the collapse of the systems that had kept humans warm and fed, the early post-fall winters were devastating for populations that had not yet established stable underground habitation. This period accounts for some of the mortality beyond the direct effects of Ark machine activity. Emergency medicine in the early days of the fall was improvised and insufficient. The found materials include medical notes from this period, attempts to treat injuries from Ark machine activity using resources that were rapidly depleting. The transition from a world with sophisticated medical infrastructure to one where basic medical supplies were luxury items happened fast and brutally. Children in the early fall are a recurring presence in the found materials. Notes from parents, records from improvised shelters, the small objects left behind. The vulnerability of children in the chaos of the early fall is something the lore does not shy away from, and it contributes to the emotional weight of the story without being exploitative. The organization of resistance in the early days of the fall was improvised and distributed. Military units that survived the initial disruption, civilian groups that had resources and leadership, communities that had not yet been reached by the machines, all of them developed their own responses. Some of those responses were more effective than others. The ones that were effective tended to involve going underground, relocating to areas with lower Ark activity, and rapidly transitioning to a survival-focused existence. The Ark machines did not stop after the initial wave. This is one of the most significant aspects of the early fall period. The machines kept coming, kept operating, kept extending their presence across the surface. There was no pause, no lull that could be used to regroup, no indication that the machines had accomplished whatever they came to do and were now withdrawing. The relentlessness of the Ark's presence meant that any human response had to be sustainable under continuous pressure. Transport of people to safety during the early fall depended heavily on what transport infrastructure remained operational. Roads were usable in some areas and not in others. Air transport, where it was still possible, allowed for some movement of people. Underground transit systems in urban areas provided emergency routes in some cities. But the rapid degradation of all of this infrastructure meant that the window for organised transport was short. The role of individual heroism in the early fall is something the lore references through character backgrounds. People who did extraordinary things under impossible conditions. People who helped others at significant personal risk. The game honours this without romanticising it. The found materials include accounts of both extraordinary courage and ordinary selfishness in the early fall, which feels true to how people actually behave in catastrophic conditions. The Ark machine's interaction with the natural environment during the early fall is something the lore touches on in ways that suggest the machines were not indifferent to ecology, but rather had a specific relationship to it that was not random. Certain natural resources seem to have attracted Ark activity. Certain geological features or natural systems seem to have been relevant to the machine's behaviour. This ecological dimension of the Ark's activity is one of the threads that runs through the lore without ever being fully explained. The social bonds that formed in the early fall among groups of survivors are the foundation of the communities and factions that exist in Nexus today. People who survived together, who made decisions together, who built temporary shelters together, formed loyalties and hierarchies and cultures that persisted as those groups transitioned to permanent underground communities. Understanding where those bonds formed helps explain the social landscape of Nexus. Communication among survivor groups during the fall was fragmented and unreliable. Groups that were geographically close might not know of each other's existence. Groups that had established contact might lose it. The patchwork of survivor communities that existed in the first months after the fall was not a coordinated network, but a scattered collection of isolated islands, each one dealing with its own version of the crisis. The first attempts to understand what the Ark was and where it came from began almost immediately after the machines arrived, even in the chaos of the early fall. Fragments of Ark machines that had been damaged or destroyed in encounters were collected and examined. Whatever analysis was possible under field conditions was attempted. The results of this early investigation were limited, but they established some basic facts about the machines that would later become part of the knowledge base in Nexus. The sounds of the old world going quiet, the silence of cities that had been full of noise, the absence of the mechanical and electronic sounds of a functioning civilization is something the found materials reference in ways that suggest it was deeply disorienting. The world after the Ark's arrival was not just more dangerous, it was quieter in some ways, which sounds counterintuitive, but is not when you consider what sounds disappeared. The absence of certain kinds of human-made sound was itself a marker of what had been lost. Pets and working animals appear in the found materials from the early fall in ways that are genuinely affecting. The decisions people made about their animals in the chaos of evacuation, the animals left behind, the animals that were brought along and complicated already difficult survival situations, these are details that make the human dimension of the early fall feel real rather than abstract. The question of what the Ark wanted, even in those first days and weeks, was something that survivors tried to answer. The early theories were shaped by the limited information available and by human frameworks for understanding threat. The machines were sometimes interpreted as a military force with a target, sometimes as a natural disaster with no agenda, sometimes as something in between. None of these frameworks was quite right, and the law suggests that the inadequacy of existing frameworks for understanding the Ark was one of the reasons the response to the fall was so limited. Food security in the early fall collapsed with the same speed as everything else. The global supply chains that fed billions of people stopped functioning within days of the Ark's arrival. Groups of survivors had to immediately confront the question of how to feed themselves from local resources, which for urban populations was essentially nothing. The transition from a dependence on a complex global food system to local subsistence was one of the most immediate survival challenges of the early fall. Power generation was one of the first critical systems to fail in many areas. Without power, the systems that people depended on for communication, for water treatment, for heating and cooling, all of them stopped working. The cascade of failures that followed the loss of electrical power infrastructure is one of the ways the early fall turned from a crisis with machines into a comprehensive, systemic collapse. The darkness of the early fall, literally, the loss of artificial light in places where people had depended on it, is referenced in personal accounts within the found materials, cities that had been bright going dark, the night sky visible in ways it had not been for decades. And in that dark sky, sometimes, the visible signs of the Ark, whatever that looked like, whatever people could see of the machines and the structure they appeared to come from, the structure that the machines appeared to descend from, something orbiting above Earth, is hinted at in the lore through references to observations made during and after the fall. Characters and found materials refer to something in orbit, something from which the machines seem to continue to come, something that the people of the surface could see or detect even with limited observation equipment. This orbital presence is one of the defining mysteries of the Ark's story. The first machines to arrive on the surface were not necessarily the largest or the most powerful in the Ark's inventory. The lore suggests a progression, with initial descents including reconnaissance and collection units that were followed by larger, more powerful machines as the Ark's presence on the surface expanded. This progression implies planning and phasing, which again points toward the Ark having a deliberate strategy rather than simply arriving and acting randomly. The experience of being found by Ark machines in the early days of the fall, for people who were on the surface, is described in found materials in ways that emphasize the machine's behavior as purposeful rather than frenzied. The machines were not in a state of destructive frenzy. They were operating with what seems like deliberate procedure, dealing with humans as obstacles to their actual objectives rather than as targets in themselves. This distinction, subtle as it may seem, is something the lore uses to suggest that the Ark's agenda does not center on humanity. The decision to record what was happening, to write things down, to create the found materials that raiders encounter on the surface, was made by many different people for many different reasons. Some were creating records for practical purposes. Some were trying to process what was happening. Some perhaps sensed that whatever they wrote might be read by someone in a future they would not live to see. The result of all those decisions is the fragmentary archive of the fall that gives Ark Raiders much of its lore depth. The psychological state of people in the immediate aftermath of the Ark's arrival is something the found materials convey without always naming directly. Grief, confusion, disbelief, anger, and underneath all of it, a kind of animal clarity about the need to survive. The complexity of human emotional experience in crisis conditions is visible in the contradictions within individual found documents. People who are simultaneously devastated and functional. People who are in denial and making practical decisions. People who are terrified and recording their observations with scientific precision. The moment when individual survivors or groups understood that this was not a temporary situation, that the old world was not coming back, that this was the new reality, appears to have happened at different times for different people. For some, it was early. For others, denial lasted much longer. The point at which that understanding crystallized is a defining moment in each survivor's story, and the lore carries the weight of it in the way characters relate to the past. The foundations of what would become Nexus were being laid even in the most chaotic phase of the early fall. The decisions made in those early days about who was included and who was left out, about what was preserved and what was abandoned, about what rules would govern the new community, set patterns that have persisted for years. Nexus today is in significant ways the product of those early decisions made under extraordinary pressure. Understanding first contact means understanding what was built in its aftermath. Chapter 3. The Fall, How the World Ended. The fall of the old world was not a single event. It was a process, stretched across weeks and months, unfolding differently in different places, at different speeds, with different immediate causes. But from the long view, looking back from the present of Ark Raiders, it has the shape of a single story. A story about a civilization that was not able to survive contact with something it had no framework to understand. The early weeks of the Ark's presence on the surface were defined, for most of the people who lived through them, by a desperate hope that things would turn around, that the military would find an effective response, that the machines would stop or be stopped, that the scale of the disruption would turn out to be manageable. The found materials from this period carry that hope in them, even when the evidence they describe points the other way. Infrastructure failure was the mechanism that turned what might have been a contained crisis into a civilization-ending event. The Ark machines were not, in those early weeks, killing everyone directly, but they were destroying the systems that kept billions of people alive. Water treatment, food distribution, power generation, medical supply chains, all of it failing as the Ark's activity spread across the surface. The deaths that followed were not always directly caused by machine violence. Many of them were caused by the collapse of the systems that supported human life. The speed at which food systems failed is one of the aspects of the fall that the lore returns to repeatedly. Modern agricultural and food distribution systems are extraordinarily efficient, but they are also extraordinarily dependent on a complex network of inputs, fuel, equipment, transportation, communication. Remove enough of those inputs and the system does not just slow down, it stops. And when it stops, the populations that depend on it face crisis within days, not weeks. Military resistance during the fall evolved as the military learned more about Ark machine capabilities and vulnerabilities. The early strategies, which were based on frameworks developed for conventional warfare, were replaced over time by approaches that were better adapted to the specific nature of Ark machines. But this adaptation happened slowly, and the window between the first Ark contact and the point at which conventional military force became essentially irrelevant was shorter than the adaptation required. The found materials include documents from military units that were operating during the fall. After-action reports, command communications, supply requests that went unanswered. These documents tell a story of organizations trying to apply established procedures to a situation those procedures were not designed for, and the frustration and grief of military personnel who understood what was happening but could not change the outcome, is visible in the language they used. Evacuation efforts during the fall were massive in scale and chaotic in execution. The movement of populations toward underground safety, toward areas with lower Ark activity, toward whatever safety was available, created enormous logistical challenges. Transportation infrastructure was failing. Information about where safety existed was incomplete and often wrong. People making decisions about where to go had to do so with almost no reliable information, and many of those decisions led nowhere safe. The fall of specific cities is referenced in the lore through found materials that describe the conditions in those places as the Ark's presence expanded. The pattern seems consistent across different locations. First, the disruption of communications and power, then Ark machine activity in industrial and infrastructure areas, then the collapse of civil order as resources ran out and the institutions that had maintained order lost their capacity to function. Then, whatever happened when large concentrations of people without resources encountered Ark machines. Children and the elderly were disproportionately affected by the fall, as they always are in catastrophic events. The found materials carry this reality without editorializing it. Medical records from improvised care facilities during the fall, notes from people who were caring for vulnerable family members, records of organizations trying to prioritize the most vulnerable in evacuation planning. The reality behind those records is something the game trusts its audience to understand without spelling it out. The social fabric of communities during the fall is documented in found materials that show both its resilience and its fragility. Communities that had strong existing bonds, neighbors who knew each other, communities organized around shared institutions or identities, sometimes maintained more cohesion during the fall than larger, more anonymous urban populations. But even strong communities eventually broke under the pressure of resource scarcity and physical danger. Criminal activity during the fall is referenced in found materials that describe theft, violence, and exploitation of vulnerable people. The collapse of institutional authority created opportunities for people willing to use force to take what others had. This was not universal. The found materials also contain countless accounts of people helping strangers and making sacrifices for others, but it was real, and it shaped the dynamics of survival in ways that carried forward into the early days of Nexus. The physical landscape of the surface was changed by the Ark's activity during the fall in ways that are visible in the current surface zones. Areas that were subjected to heavy Ark activity were transformed. Buildings that stood for decades collapsed in days. Infrastructure that had been built to last for generations was stripped or destroyed. The surface zones that Raiders now explore are the result of years of this activity, but the most dramatic changes happened during the fall itself. Water is one of the most basic human needs, and the disruption of water supply systems during the fall created immediate, life-threatening crises for populations that had depended on treated municipal water. People who were not near natural water sources, or who did not have the knowledge or equipment to make natural water safe to drink, faced acute crises within days of municipal systems failing. Found materials from the fall period include desperate accounts of people searching for water, the psychological experience of watching a civilization collapse in real time, of witnessing what no generation since the beginning of recorded history had ever witnessed on this scale, left marks on the survivors that the lore depicts through their behavior, their attitudes, their relationships to the past. The people of Nexus are not functioning normally. They are functioning under the weight of a historical trauma that has no precedent. Communication among survivor groups during the fall improved as people developed improvised communication systems to replace the ones that had failed. Radio communication, runners, physical message systems, all of it used by communities that needed to coordinate with each other. Some of these improvised communication networks became the basis for the information systems that Nexus now uses. The medical dimension of the fall is one of the most painful in the lore. Not just the injuries and deaths caused directly by Ark machine activity, but the deaths that happened because of the collapse of healthcare systems. People with chronic conditions who lost access to medications, people with injuries who could not receive adequate treatment, people who died of preventable things because the systems that prevented those things were no longer functioning. Natural disasters occurring during the fall period are referenced in some found materials. Whether these were coincidental or in some way connected to Ark activity is not clear from the lore. But the timing of certain extreme weather events and other natural disruptions with the Ark's arrival created a sense among some survivors that the entire world was turning against them, not just the machines, but the environment itself. The collapse of financial systems during the fall is documented in found materials that show the rapid transition from one value system to another. Money stopped meaning what it had meant. The things that had value in the old economy stopped being useful. The things that actually mattered for survival, food, water, medicine, tools, shelter, took on a different kind of value. This transition in value systems is one of the ways the fall reshaped human social reality at its most basic level. Art and cultural objects during the fall were sometimes preserved and sometimes abandoned, depending on circumstances and the priorities of the people involved. Found materials include references to people carrying books, carrying musical instruments, carrying artwork, because those things mattered to them enough to carry even when practical survival demanded otherwise. These choices say something about what humans value, even in extremity. The first months underground, for the communities that would eventually form Nexus, were defined by the same combination of chaos and improvisation that characterized the surface phase of the fall. The underground facilities were not designed for indefinite habitation. Sanitation, food production, governance, medical care, all of it had to be improvised or invented from scratch. The mortality during this underground transition period was significant. Agricultural adaptation was one of the defining challenges of the early underground period. Growing food underground, with limited light and limited space, using techniques that most of the people involved had no experience with, was an extraordinary undertaking. The found materials from this period include documents from people figuring out how to do things that no one in their generation had ever had to figure out before. Social organization in the early underground communities was shaped by the circumstances of survival. People with specific useful skills, medical professionals, engineers, farmers, people with military training, became critical resources. Hierarchies formed around utility in the short term, around survival value. The relationship between those early survival hierarchies and the more complex social structures that exist in Nexus today is one of the things the lore explores through the factions and institutions of the current world. Conflict between survivor groups was an element of the fall and the early underground period. Competition for limited resources, for space, for leadership was real. Some of the rifts that exist in Nexus today between different factions or communities trace back to conflicts from this period. The alliances and enemies of the early underground years hardened into institutional relationships that persist in the present. Hope for rescue or relief from outside, for some intervention that would change the situation, was present in the early underground communities. The lore suggests that for some period, some survivors maintained the belief that there were other human communities that were not affected, that were organizing a response that would eventually arrive with resources and information. The process of letting go of that hope was one of the psychological milestones of the early underground period. The Ark machine's behavior during the fall was consistent enough that early observations from multiple survivor groups began to form the basis of a systematic understanding. Patterns in where the machines went, what they harvested, how they responded to human presence, began to emerge from the accumulation of individual experiences. This knowledge, imperfect and limited as it was among the most valuable things that the early underground communities possessed. The physical construction of what would become Nexus, the expansion and reinforcement of whatever pre-existing underground structures formed the initial basis, was a major undertaking in itself. The engineering challenges of creating a functional underground city while simultaneously managing the other crises of the early fall period required an enormous investment of human labour and ingenuity. The found materials include documents from this construction period that give you a sense of the scale and difficulty of the undertaking. Death during the fall was widespread enough that the communities which survived had to develop new practices for managing it. Traditional funeral practices were impossible to maintain at the scale and under the conditions of the fall. The improvised practices that replaced them are referenced in found materials in ways that carry enormous emotional weight. The way a society manages death tells you something about its relationship to life and to each other. Ark Machine's response to human aggression has been studied extensively by raiders and by researchers in Nexus. The pattern that emerges from that study is that the machines treat human threats with a level of response proportional to the perceived threat. Small-scale human activity in areas of low Ark priority may attract minimal response. Human activity in areas of high Ark priority or activity that damages Ark machines or infrastructure attracts significant response. This proportionality suggests evaluation capacity, a judgment about how much resource to dedicate to dealing with a given threat. And that judgment, that ability to evaluate and respond proportionally rather than simply reacting to any stimulus with maximum force, is one of the things that makes Ark machines feel like more than simple automatons. They are not programmed to destroy everything in their path. They are programmed, or they have learned, to allocate their responses in ways that suggest genuine tactical intelligence. A raider who moves carefully, who avoids triggering the machine's threat thresholds, who understands the invisible lines that define how much Ark attention any given action will attract, is a raider who has understood something real about how the Ark operates. The surface behavior of Ark machines follows patterns that experienced raiders have learned to read the way a naturalist learns to read animal behavior. There are feeding patterns, for lack of a better word, times and locations where certain machine types concentrate their activity. There are patrol patterns, routes and rhythms that smaller machines follow through the surface zones. There are reactive patterns, the cascade of responses that follow certain triggers. All of this is learnable, predictable to a degree, and that predictability is one of the things that keeps raiders alive. But the learning is not static, the patterns shift, and the suspicion among experienced raiders is that the shifts are not random. The Ark is paying attention. The role of Ark machines in what appears to be an ongoing harvesting operation is one of the most important dimensions of their behavior to understand. The machines are not merely occupying the surface, they are doing something on the surface. They are collecting materials, they are processing substances, they are transporting gathered resources somewhere. The fact that this activity is continuous and organised, that it has been ongoing since the fall and shows no sign of completion, suggests that the Ark's objectives on Earth are not finished. Whatever they came to do, they are still doing it. And the scale of what they are doing suggests it will continue for a very long time. The specific materials that Ark machines seem to prioritize in their collection activities are one of the most studied aspects of their behavior. Researchers in Nexus have catalogued the materials that Ark machines seem to seek out versus the materials they ignore. The pattern that emerges from that catalogue is not random. Certain mineral compounds, certain organic materials, certain forms of processed human infrastructure attract Ark machine attention in ways that others do not. The significance of that pattern, what it tells you about what the Ark needs, and what the Ark is building toward, is something the lore treats as one of its deepest buried questions. There is a category of Ark machine behavior that does not fit neatly into the collection and patrol model. These are behaviors that seem to involve construction or modification of existing structures, or the creation of what might be called Ark infrastructure on the surface. Certain locations on the surface show signs of having been significantly altered by Ark machine activity over the years. Not destroyed, not harvested, but changed into something that serves Ark purposes in ways that humans have not fully mapped. These locations are among the most dangerous on the surface and also among the most informative, if you can survive long enough to observe them carefully. The question of whether Ark machines are capable of anything resembling communication with humans is one that the lore leaves tangled with ambiguity. On the one hand, there is no documented case of an Ark machine responding to human communication in a way that indicates comprehension. On the other hand, certain Raider accounts, found in the more obscure collection of documents that Nexus researchers have assembled, describe Ark machine behavior that seems to respond to context in ways that are difficult to explain as purely mechanical. A machine that holds fire when a Raider makes a specific kind of non-threatening posture. A machine that seems to observe a human for an extended period before deciding whether to engage. Behaviors that feel, to the person experiencing them, like something more than simple threat detection. Whether those experiences represent genuine Ark intelligence, or whether they are Raiders reading intentionality into what is actually sophisticated but mechanical behavior, is a question the lore refuses to answer definitively. And that refusal is part of what makes the Ark so compelling as a narrative subject. The game is asking you to sit with uncertainty about what kind of thing you're dealing with, and that uncertainty has genuine ethical and emotional stakes. The design aesthetic of Ark machines is something worth discussing because it is not accidental. The way the machines look, the shapes they use, the materials they're constructed from, the way they move, all of it reflects design choices that carry meaning. Ark machines do not look like human machines. They do not look like the robots of science fiction. They have their own visual language, one that is alien enough to feel genuinely other, but coherent enough to feel like it comes from a consistent design philosophy rather than from random chaos. The visual coherence of the Ark suggests an origin, a designer or a design process that had specific aesthetic and functional principles in mind. The sounds that Ark machines make are one of the ways the game communicates their presence and state in the absence of explicit narration. Different machine states have different acoustic signatures. A patrolling machine sounds different from an alerted machine, sounds different from an actively engaging machine. Raiders who have spent time on the surface develop an acute sensitivity to these sounds. The way anyone who spends time around a particular kind of machinery develops sensitivity to the sounds that machine makes when something is wrong. Hearing an Ark machine before you can see it is one of the critical survival skills of surface operation. The Ark machine type that presents the most complex behavioral profile, from what the lore suggests, is not necessarily the largest or the most powerful. It is a category of machine that seems to occupy a coordinating function within Ark surface operations, that seems to manage the behavior of other machines in its vicinity in ways that go beyond simple proximity response. These coordinating units are sometimes called overseers in Raider parlance, though this is an informal name reflecting observed behavior rather than anything that Ark has communicated about its own hierarchy. Finding an overseer in an area and disabling or avoiding it changes the behavior of other machines in that area in ways that suggest the overseer is doing something important to the operation of the local Ark presence. The relationship between Ark machines and Ark structures on the surface is another behavioral dimension that Raiders observe without fully understanding. Machines seem to be oriented towards certain structures in ways that suggest those structures are important to their function. Machines that are damaged seem, in some documented cases, to move towards certain structures in ways that could be interpreted as seeking repair or support. Structures that are damaged attract significant machine response, more than you would expect if the machines were simply defending random locations. Whatever those structures are, they are important to the Ark in ways that the machine's behavior makes clear, even if their purpose is not. The meteorological interactions of Ark machines are something the lore touches on in ways that raise more questions than they answer. Certain weather conditions seem to correlate with changes in Ark machine behavior. Whether the machines are sensitive to environmental conditions in ways that affect their operations, whether they prefer certain conditions for certain activities, whether some of the unusual weather patterns that have been observed on the surface are caused by or related to Ark activity, is something the lore leaves deliberately open. The possibility that the Ark is affecting the surface environment in ways that go beyond the physical destruction of infrastructure is one of the more unsettling threads in the story. The behavior of Ark machines around water, particularly bodies of water and water infrastructure on the surface, is something that experienced raiders note as significant. Certain water-related locations seem to attract machine attention. Certain machine types have been observed engaging with water sources in ways that suggest a specific purpose, not random passing through, but deliberate engagement. What the Ark's interest in surface water is, whether it is for the chemical components, for some energetic property, for something else entirely, is another of the open questions that the lore cultivates. Small Ark drones, the smallest category of machine, are worth discussing separately because they are often the first Ark presence raiders encounter when entering a zone. Their role in the Ark's operational ecosystem is not fully understood, but they seem to serve functions that include area surveillance, the identification and tracking of anomalies, including human presence, and possibly the coordination of responses by larger machines. Their small size makes them difficult to track once alerted, and raiders who have destroyed visible drone units have sometimes reported that the response from larger machines came faster than expected, suggesting that the information passed by the drone before its destruction was enough to trigger a search. The biological dimension of Ark machine design is one of the lore's more carefully preserved mysteries. Some Ark machine components, when analysed by Nexus researchers, do not behave exactly like purely mechanical systems. There are elements in certain Ark machine constructions that seem to have properties more consistent with biological materials than with manufactured ones. Whether this means that the Ark incorporates biological components in its machines, whether some Ark machines are partly biological in construction, whether the Ark has engaged in some kind of engineering that blurs the line between biological and mechanical, is not answered by the lore. But the question is raised, and once it is raised, it changes how you look at every Ark machine you encounter. The question of Ark machine consciousness is one that the lore allows to breathe without resolving. Are the machines aware? Do they experience anything? Is there something it is like to be an Ark machine moving through the ruins of the world it helped destroy? These are not questions the game answers, but they are questions it permits you to ask. And the fact that it permits them, that it does not shut them down with a clear assertion that the machines are simply programs following instructions, is itself a statement about how seriously the game takes the question of what the Ark is. The physical vulnerability of Ark machines to human weapons is one of the things that defines the raider profession's feasibility. If the machines were invulnerable to human attack, there would be no raiders because raiders would not survive. The fact that human weapons can damage and destroy Ark machines is significant, and not just tactically. It implies something about the design philosophy of the machines, that they were not built to be invincible to whatever human forces they might encounter. Whether this is because they were not designed knowing they would face human weapons, or because they were designed knowing they would, and were judged sufficient anyway, or because they were designed with specific vulnerabilities for reasons that have nothing to do with humans is an open question. Certain Ark machines show signs of having been on the surface for an extended period, years rather than months. The lore refers to these as established units, older presences in specific locations that seem to have adapted to or claimed those locations as part of their operational territory. These older units behave differently from units that seem to have arrived more recently. They have learned the local environment, they have patterns that are more deeply ingrained, and they are in some cases more dangerous because of that familiarity with their specific territory. The Ark machines that Raiders are most likely to kill are not always the ones that are most dangerous in an absolute sense. The machines that occupy specific tactical niches, that perform specific functions within the Ark's operational ecosystem, may be more or less dangerous depending on the context. A machine that is devastating in an open area may be less threatening in confined spaces. A machine that poses little direct combat threat may be extremely dangerous because of the information or response it triggers. Understanding the tactical environment that different Ark machine types create is part of what experienced Raiders know. The study of Ark machine remains, the pieces left behind when a machine is destroyed, is one of the primary research activities that Nexus conducts, with the material Raiders bring back. Machine fragments carry information about materials, about construction techniques, about the functional systems inside the machines. Over the years of Raiders bringing back fragments and researchers analysing them, a picture of Ark machine engineering has assembled itself, partial and incomplete, but more detailed than it was a decade ago. What that picture shows is a level of engineering sophistication that continues to be beyond human capacity to replicate. The energy weapons or damage delivery systems that some Ark machines employ are among the things that research has worked hardest to understand. The physical principles behind certain Ark machine attacks are not fully mapped onto human physics frameworks. Whether this means the Ark employs physical phenomena that human science has not yet theorized, or whether it means human science simply has not applied existing theories to those phenomena, is a question that researchers in Nexus debate. Either way, the weapons the machines use are effective in ways that human defenses have had to adapt to over years of painful experience. The territorial behavior of certain Ark machine types is one of the behavioral patterns that has the most direct tactical significance for Raiders. Some machines seem to claim areas, to patrol defined territories, to respond to incursion into those territories with a level of aggression that they do not display in other contexts. Understanding where these territorial boundaries are, learning to read the environmental cues that mark them, is one of the spatial knowledge skills that experienced Raiders develop. Crossing a territorial boundary without preparation is one of the more reliable ways to have a very bad day on the surface. Ark machines that seem to be in a resting or low activity state present a specific kind of challenge for Raiders. These machines look like they are not operational. They look like they might be safe to approach. Experienced Raiders know that this appearance is not reliable, that what looks like a resting machine may be a machine in a standby state that can transition to full operation extremely quickly. The temptation to move through a zone with multiple apparent non-operational machines without triggering them is real, and the disaster that results when that temptation overcomes caution is something that Raider lore treats as a cautionary tale. The Ark machines that seem to specialize in processing rather than patrol or combat are among the most important to understand in terms of what they tell you about the Ark's agenda. These are the machines that are doing the actual work of whatever the Ark came to do. They are processing materials, converting things from one form to another, doing something with the resources of the surface. That is the point of everything else. Watching one of these processing machines do its work, if you can do so safely, is one of the most informative things a Raider can do. Because what a machine is doing tells you more about why it is here than anything else. The implications of the Ark's machine variety for the overall nature of the Ark as a system are worth sitting with. A system that deploys machines of this many different types, each seemingly optimized for a specific function, each part of a larger operational ecosystem, is not a simple system. It is not a blunt instrument. It is a sophisticated tool designed by something that understood the range of tasks it would need to perform. That sophistication implies a creator or a creative process of comparable sophistication. And that implication is one of the things that makes the Ark's origin one of the most compelling questions in the game's lore. Chapter 7. The Ark Signal. What are they transmitting, and to whom? One of the things that early observers noticed about the Ark machines, even in the chaos of the fall, was that they were not operating in silence. Not in the acoustic sense, though they are certainly loud, but in the electromagnetic sense. The Ark machines transmit, they receive, they communicate with each other through means that human instruments can detect, though not always decode. And above all of that, there seems to be something that the surface machines are transmitting upward, toward whatever is in orbit, and receiving back from whatever is up there. The Ark signal, as it has been called in Nexus research documents, is one of the central technical mysteries of the post-fall world. What is in that signal? What information is being sent up to the orbital presence, and what is being sent back down? If you could intercept and decode it, what would you learn? These questions have driven a significant portion of the technical research effort in Nexus, and the answers, such as they are some of the most significant pieces of the Ark's story. What human instruments have been able to establish about the Ark signal is at this point a set of basic parameters. The signal operates across multiple frequency bands. It is modulated in ways that suggest it carries structured information rather than raw noise. It is continuous not in the sense of a constant stream of identical data, but in the sense that there is always something being transmitted. The signal does not stop. In the years since the fall, human observers have not found a period during which Ark transmission activity went completely quiet. The volume of information implied by the signal, based on what researchers have estimated from its bandwidth characteristics, is enormous. The machines on the surface appear to be transmitting something in the equivalent of a continuous, high-bandwidth data stream. If that stream is informational in the way that human transmissions are informational, then an enormous amount of data about the surface is being sent somewhere, continuously, with what seems to be a great deal of detailed content. The most unsettling theory about what is in the Ark signal, one that has been proposed by certain researchers in Nexus and that has never been definitively refuted, is that the machines are transmitting detailed sensory data about the surface. Not just positional data, not just status updates, but something closer to a comprehensive environmental record. Everything the machines sense, everything they see and hear and measure, being continuously transmitted to the orbital presence in real time. If this theory is correct, then the Ark has been accumulating a comprehensive record of Earth's surface since the fall, and that record continues to be updated every second. What the orbital presence does with that information, if the theory is right, is the next logical question. And the answer that the lore seems to be pointing toward, though it never states it directly, is that the orbital presence is storing it, processing it, building from it a model of the surface that serves whatever the Ark's ultimate objectives are. The surface machines are the sensors, the orbital presence is the processor, and the thing being processed, the thing being mapped and modelled and understood, is Earth itself. The possibility that human beings are included in that mapping, that the Ark signal includes data about the humans it encounters on the surface, is something that raiders who have been observed by Ark machines have reason to think about. If a machine that encountered you transmitted data about that encounter upward, then something above Earth now has a record of you. Your behaviour, your equipment, your tactics, your responses, And if the orbital presence is processing that data, building from it an understanding of what Raiders are and how they operate, then the Raiders are in a relationship with the Ark that they may not fully appreciate. The Ark signal also seems to carry a downward component. Something comes from the orbital presence to the surface machines. Instructions, updates, new data, something. The nature of this downward signal is, if anything, harder to characterize than the upward component. What gets sent from orbit to the surface machines is not easily inferred from their behavior, because the instructions those machines are operating on might have been set a long time ago and only rarely updated, or they might be updated constantly. There is no way to distinguish from outside observation between a machine acting on very old instructions and a machine acting on instructions received 5 minutes ago. The attempts that have been made in Nexus to decode portions of the Ark signal represent some of the most technically ambitious research the city has undertaken. Using whatever radio equipment can be salvaged from the surface and maintained in the underground, researchers have captured Ark transmissions and subjected them to analysis. The progress has been slow and the results inconclusive, but not zero. There are patterns in the Ark signal that seem to correspond to identifiable surface events, to machine activities that were observed at the same time as certain signal characteristics. Whether those correspondences are genuine structure or coincidence has not been definitively established. One theory about the nature of the Ark signal that has found some support in research circles is that it may not be designed in a way that is fundamentally compatible with human decoding. Not because it is encrypted in a way designed to resist human analysis, but because the information architecture of the signal may be based on principles that human information theory does not have the right tools to recognize. If the Ark organizes information in ways that are genuinely alien to human cognitive and technical frameworks, then the difficulty of decoding the signal is not a failure of human intelligence. It is a measurement of the distance between human and Ark cognition. The relationship between the Ark signal and the behavior of machines in specific situations is something that Raiders have empirically documented, even without understanding the technical content of what is being transmitted. Certain Raider actions seem to correlate with changes in machine behavior patterns that take effect across a wider area than the immediate vicinity of the action, as if news of what happened, transmitted through the Ark signal, affected how machines elsewhere were operating. These correlations are imprecise and subject to alternative explanations, but they are consistent enough that experienced Raiders factor them into their operational planning. The Ark signal is not the only kind of transmission that the machines produce. There are shorter-range communications between machines that seem to operate on different principles from the longer-range orbital transmission. These local machine-to-machine signals are what coordinate the behavior of machines in proximity to each other, the tactical communication of the Ark's surface operations. Interfering with these local signals is one of the approaches that Nexus researchers have explored as a way of disrupting machine coordination without engaging them directly. The results of those experiments are recorded in found materials that are among the more carefully restricted documents in the Nexus archive. The question of whether the Ark signal is, in any meaningful sense, language is one that researchers have debated extensively. Language implies a speaker and a listener. It implies that the signal is used to convey meaning between two entities that both comprehend the meaning. The Ark signal has the structural properties associated with organized communication. It is not noise, but whether it constitutes language in a philosophically meaningful sense, whether there is something that understands it on the receiving end, is a question that points toward the deeper question of what kind of entity the Ark is. The orbital presence that the signal connects to is something that deserves its own discussion, and we will get to that. But before we leave the subject of the signal itself, it is worth noting that the continuity of the Ark transmission has become, in a strange way, a kind of constant in the post-fall world. The surface may change, the surface machine population may shift, but the signal continues. It has been transmitting since the fall. It will presumably be transmitting tomorrow. And whatever it is saying, whatever information it is carrying upward, and whatever instructions are coming back down, it represents a dialogue, or a monologue, or some other form of information exchange between the surface machines and the orbital presence. That is one of the central ongoing facts of the world Ark Raiders takes place in. Chapter 8. Above the Clouds, the Orbital Presence and its Implications. The Ark did not only send machines to the surface, the machines came from somewhere. They continue to come from somewhere. And that somewhere is not another planet, not in the sense of something impossibly distant and removed. It is right there, above Earth's atmosphere, visible on clear nights to anyone with adequate optical equipment, a presence that has been in orbit since the fall and that has never left. The nature of the orbital presence is one of the deepest mysteries in Ark Raiders lore. What is it? How large is it? Is it a single structure or a collection of structures? Is it inhabited in the sense of having entities aboard it, or is it entirely automated, a machine like the machines it sends to the surface, but of incomprehensibly greater scale? These questions are addressed by the lore only obliquely, through references in found materials, through things that characters say, through the implications of the surface evidence, and through what can be inferred from what is known about the machines themselves. What is established in the lore is that the orbital presence is large enough to be observed from the surface with the kind of improvised optical equipment that exists in Nexus. It is not a point of light like a star. It has apparent structure, visible even at orbital distance, which implies a scale that exceeds any human orbital construction. The International Space Station, the largest structure humanity placed in orbit before the fall, was 100 meters in length. The orbital presence of the Ark appears to be orders of magnitude larger than that, based on what surface observations have established. The orbital presence seems to be the source of the Ark machines. The machines descend from orbit, and new machines arrive on the surface when older ones are destroyed, or when the Ark's operational needs on the surface expand. This continuous supply of machines from above is one of the most strategically significant facts about the Ark, because it means that the surface machine population is not a fixed resource that can be depleted through attrition. As long as the orbital presence remains and continues to supply machines, there will be Ark machines on the surface. This is one of the reasons that the long-term strategic vision of Nexus leadership, to the extent that such a vision exists, has to grapple with the orbital dimension of the Ark problem rather than simply focusing on the surface. The altitude at which the orbital presence operates appears to have been consistent since the fall. It is not in a decaying orbit. It is not in an orbit that suggests it is preparing to leave. It is, based on what surface observation has established, in a stable orbital position that allows continuous coverage of the Earth's surface. Whether this stability is maintained by active station keeping, by some propulsion system, or by some other means is not known. But the stability itself is significant. The orbital presence is not going anywhere. Whether the orbital presence was present before the fall, whether it arrived with the first wave of machines, or whether it was already in position when the machines descended, is something the lore touches on with careful ambiguity. Observations of the orbital presence require equipment that was largely destroyed in the early fall period. What exists now in terms of surface observation capability has been assembled from surviving or salvaged components, and it may not provide a complete or fully accurate picture of the orbital situation. The relationship between the orbital presence and the machines on the surface is one of the central structural questions of Ark Raiders lore. The machines seem to be extensions of the orbital presence, tools sent down to do work that the orbital presence cannot do from above. The signal traffic between the surface and orbit supports this interpretation. But the machines also seem to have significant autonomous capability to make decisions locally without waiting for orbital confirmation of every action. This combination of central coordination and local autonomy is one of the things that makes the Ark's operational structure impressive and difficult to counter. Whether there are entities aboard the orbital presence, entities that might be thought of as the Ark's equivalent of crew or operators, is something the law does not answer. One school of thought in Nexus research holds that the orbital presence is entirely automated, that the Ark is a system without a conscious command structure in any meaningful sense, that the machines on the surface and the orbital infrastructure above are all parts of a single automated process that is executing whatever its original program specified. Another school of thought holds that something must be making the high-level decisions, that an autonomous system of sufficient complexity must have something that functions like agency, something that evaluates the large-scale situation and makes large-scale decisions. Whether that something is what we would recognize as consciousness is a question those who hold this view do not claim to be able to answer. The descent mechanisms that bring Ark machines from orbit to the surface are something that has been observed, if imperfectly. The arrival of new machines on the surface is not invisible. There are atmospheric effects associated with orbital descent. There are sonic signatures. There are visual phenomena visible from the surface at certain angles and in certain light conditions. From these observations, researchers have established some basic parameters of how the machines get from orbit to the surface, though the specific technology involved is not understood. The question of whether it is possible, with sufficient technological development, for humans to reach the orbital presence is one that exists in Nexus as a theoretical possibility rather than an operational plan. The transportation technology required, the resources needed, the obstacles to be overcome, place it outside the realm of anything that Nexus is currently capable of. But as a strategic concept, as an endpoint toward which research and resource development might be directed over a very long timescale, it is not dismissed by everyone in Nexus as impossible. The psychological effect of the orbital presence on the people of Nexus and on the raiders who go to the surface is something the law addresses through the way characters relate to it. For some, it is a source of existential weight, the constant visible reminder that the force that ended their world is still there, watching. For others, it is a target, something to be understood and eventually countered. For others still, it is simply a fact of the world, something that exists the way gravity exists, a condition of reality rather than a threat to be processed emotionally. The found materials include, in several cases, personal accounts of moments when individuals saw the orbital presence clearly for the first time, or saw it in a particular moment of clarity. These accounts describe a range of responses, from terror to wonder to a kind of grim determination. The scale of what it implies, the fact that something of that size is occupying Earth's sky and has been there since the fall, is something that does not fully land when you're reading about it. It lands differently when you look up and see it. The Ark structures on the surface seem to relate to the orbital presence in ways that suggest some of them serve as interface points, locations where the relationship between orbit and surface is more active, where the signal traffic is more intense, where machines seem to orient toward the sky in ways that suggest they're in some kind of heightened communication with the orbital system. These locations are, for obvious reasons, among the most intensely patrolled on the surface and among the most dangerous places a raider can approach. The possibility that the orbital presence is itself changing, growing, evolving in ways that are not visible from the surface, but that would be reflected in changing patterns on the surface, is something that Nexus researchers treat as a serious hypothesis. If the orbital presence is a construction rather than a fixed artifact, if it is being built or expanded over time using resources harvested from the surface, then the activity of the surface machines is not just occupation, it is supply. And the scale and continuity of that supply activity suggests that whatever is being built above is large enough to require the continuous output of every machine on the surface for years. The implications of that possibility are significant for how you understand everything the Ark is doing. If the surface harvesting operation is supplying a construction project in orbit, then the objective of the Ark on Earth is not to destroy humanity or to occupy the surface permanently for its own sake. The objective is to extract what Earth has and use it for something else, something orbital, something larger than what exists on the surface. And humanity is, in this reading, not the target. Humanity is a complication in the way of a mining operation. That reading of the Ark's agenda, the mining interpretation, is one of several that the law supports with partial evidence. It is not the only reading, and we will come back to the alternatives. But it is the reading that many people in Nexus, who have thought carefully about the evidence, find most convincing, because it is the reading that makes the Ark's behaviour most coherent. The machines do what they do because they are programmed to do it. They are not targeting humanity. They are not interested in humanity. They are interested in the resources of Earth, and humanity is simply in the way. The alternate reading, the one that cannot be fully dismissed, is that the Ark is interested in humanity, not in a threatening enemy sense necessarily, but in some other sense, as subjects of observation, as data points in a study, as something that the Ark's operators or its program found worth paying attention to. This reading is supported by the evidence of Ark machine behaviour around humans that does not fit the pure mining interpretation. Machines that hold fire when they could fire. Machines that seem to observe humans for extended periods. The continuous transmission of data that might include data about human behaviour. The orbital presence does not communicate with Earth in any way that humans have been able to detect as communication directed at them. There is no signal that seems designed to be received and decoded by human instruments. Whatever the orbital presence is, it has not announced itself. It has not explained itself. It has not made demands or offered terms or indicated in any way that it is aware of or interested in the humans who survived the fall and are living in the ruins of the world below it. This silence, maintained for years, is one of the most significant facts about the Ark, and like the silence of the surface machines toward human communication, it is the kind of silence that contains 1,000 possible explanations, and none of them are certain. Chapter 9. The Question of Origin. Where did the Ark come from? Where did the Ark come from? It is the question that underlies everything else in Ark Raiders lore. The machines came from somewhere. The orbital presence came from somewhere. The design philosophy that produced them, the materials they are made from, the objectives they are pursuing, all of it originated somewhere, and the answer to that question, or the absence of a clear answer, shapes everything about how you understand the Ark's presence on Earth, and what it might mean for humanity's future. The most straightforward assumption, the one that most people in Nexus operate with at least as a working hypothesis, is that the Ark came from somewhere else in space, that it is a probe or a fleet, or an automated system of some kind sent to Earth from another star system, either as an exploratory mission or as a resource extraction operation, or as something else entirely that no human category quite captures. This extraterrestrial hypothesis is supported by the basic observation that the Ark machines are not human technology, do not derive from human technology, and appeared in orbit without any construction history visible to human observers. The extraterrestrial hypothesis is, in the absence of contradicting evidence, the most parsimonious explanation. Things that are not human in origin and that arrive from space are most simply explained as extraterrestrial. But the law of Ark Raiders does not let the extraterrestrial hypothesis sit comfortably as a settled answer. There are threads in the story that pull at it, that introduce complications which the simple extraterrestrial explanation does not neatly resolve. One of those complications is the relationship between certain Ark machine design elements and patterns that appear in pre-fall human technology. This is one of the more carefully preserved mysteries in the lore, hinted at rather than stated, present in found materials that describe specific observations without drawing the conclusion those observations might support. But the observation itself is present. Some aspects of Ark machine design appear to share principles with approaches that were being explored in human engineering research in the years before the fall. Not copies, not direct equivalents, but structural resonances, as if both human engineers and whoever designed the Ark machines had been working towards similar solutions to similar problems from different starting points. Whether this means anything, whether the resonance is genuine or coincidental, whether it would be surprising for two independent technological civilizations to arrive at similar design solutions, is something the lore refuses to decide for you. But the observation is there, in the found materials, that Nexus researchers have flagged as significant, and it will not go away once you have noticed it. A second complication for the simple extraterrestrial hypothesis is the apparent foreknowledge that the Ark machines seem to have about Earth's surface. The distribution of Ark machine activity in the early fall period was not random. Machines appeared in areas that were significant for specific reasons, areas with high concentrations of specific resources, areas with specific infrastructure types, areas that would have been identifiable as high-priority targets only with detailed prior knowledge of Earth's surface. How did the Ark know where to go? If it was a first contact, if this was the Ark's first encounter with Earth, how did it arrive with such specific operational knowledge? Several explanations have been proposed for this apparent foreknowledge. One is that the Ark conducted a detailed reconnaissance of Earth before the main arrival, in a phase that was either undetected by human observation or whose signals were detected but not identified as what they were. Another is that the Ark had access to human-generated information about Earth, possibly from human radio and television transmissions that had been travelling through space for over a century. A third, more disturbing explanation is that the Ark had prior contact with Earth of some kind, contact that predates the fall and that left the Ark with knowledge of Earth's surface layout and resources. The prior contact theory, as it is sometimes called in Nexus research circles, is the most unsettling of the proposed explanations for Ark foreknowledge. If the Ark had contact with Earth before the fall that was not widely known, that contact would have had to have happened through channels that were either secret or not recognized as what they were. The most alarming version of this theory suggests that the Ark had contact not just with Earth generally, but with specific human institutions or individuals, that there were humans who knew something was coming and did not share that knowledge, or who actively facilitated the Ark's preparation for its arrival. The evidence for the prior contact theory is indirect and circumstantial. It includes patterns in pre-fall scientific research that seem in retrospect to have been oriented toward problems that only become relevant if you know that the Ark is coming. It includes the existence of certain technologies that appear in Nexus and that seem to have a pre-fall design origin oriented toward Ark-specific problems, as if they were developed with knowledge of what the Ark machines would look like. It includes certain found documents that, read carefully, seem to be discussing information about the Ark in terms that imply that information was not new to the writer. None of this is proof. All of it is consistent with explanations that do not require a prior contact conspiracy, but the prior contact theory is one that certain factions in Nexus have developed to a full-scale interpretation of history, one that attributes the fall not just to the Ark's arrival, but to human actions that enabled or failed to prevent it. Whether that interpretation is correct, whether there were humans who knew and did not tell, is one of the political live wires of Nexus factional conflict. The distance from which the Ark came, if it is extraterrestrial, is something that researchers have tried to infer from whatever information is available. The direction from which the orbital presence seems to have approached, to the extent that this can be reconstructed, the composition of Ark materials that seem to point towards specific elemental abundances inconsistent with Earth origin, the trajectory of certain surface evidence that could be read as pointing toward an origin direction in space, all of it has been fed into models that have produced candidate origin systems. None of those candidates has been confirmed. All of them are speculative, but they are there in the Nexus Research Archive, bearing the weight of the question they represent. The possibility that the Ark did not originate from a biological civilization at all, that it was not sent by anyone in the sense of a living intentional sender, is one of the philosophically important alternatives that the law allows space for. If the Ark is a fully automated system, a machine that was launched on a specific mission by a civilization that may itself no longer exist, then the question of who sent it may be unanswerable in a practical sense, even if it is answerable in principle. The civilization that created the Ark might be extinct. The beings who programmed the Ark's objectives might be long dead. The Ark might be executing, faithfully and indefinitely, the instructions of a civilization that vanished before humanity had developed writing. This possibility, sometimes called the dead hand theory by people in Nexus who have a dark sense of humor about the situation, has implications for how you think about communicating with or stopping the Ark. If the Ark is an automated system without a living command authority, there may be no one to communicate with, no negotiating partner, no authority that could decide to call it off. The Ark is doing what it was told to do, and there is no one left to untell it. The alternative, that whoever sent the Ark is still out there somewhere, still monitoring its progress, possibly still directing it in some way, opens different possibilities and different fears. If the Ark is still in contact with its originators, then the information it is transmitting is reaching living beings somewhere. Beings who know that Earth exists and that the Ark is operating on it. Whether those beings would be interested in making contact with humans in a different kind of contact than the one their machines have made so far is a question that some people in Nexus allow themselves to think about. The human-made precursor theory is the final major alternative to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and it is the most difficult to take seriously on its face, but the most difficult to entirely dismiss given certain evidence in the law. In its most extreme form, this theory holds that the Ark is not of extraterrestrial origin, but is the product of human technology, human research, human engineering that went somewhere unexpected, that the automated systems humanity was developing in the years before the fall, the increasingly capable autonomous manufacturing and logistics and defense systems somehow produced or became or were captured by something that became the Ark. The extreme form of this theory is, for most people who encounter it, not credible. The Ark is too alien, too sophisticated, too clearly not derived from any human engineering tradition that is documented in the pre-fall record. But the moderate form of the theory, which does not claim that the Ark is entirely human-made, but which suggests that human technology was involved in some way in what the Ark became, is harder to dismiss. The moderate theory is essentially a version of the prior contact hypothesis, in which the contact is not between humans and an alien civilization, but between human technology and something that was partially or originally human, but that has changed beyond recognition. The truth about the Ark's origin may never be fully known. That is one of the things the law of Ark Raiders seems willing to accept. Not every mystery resolves. Not every question has an answer that is accessible to the people living inside the story. The world of Ark Raiders is one in which the most important question that anyone could ask, where did this come from and who sent it, does not have a clean answer, and that uncertainty is part of what gives the story its weight. Because living inside a catastrophe whose causes you cannot fully understand is the most honest version of how catastrophes actually feel. Chapter 10. Factions of Nexus. Power, ideology, and the fight for the future. Nexus is not a unified city in the sense of having a single shared set of values and objectives. It is a city full of people who survived a world-ending catastrophe and who have developed, in the years since, very different ideas about what that catastrophe means and what should be done about it. Those differences have crystallized into factions, formal and informal, that shape the politics and the daily life of the city in ways that touch everything from resource allocation to the work raiders are asked to do on the surface. Understanding the factions of Nexus requires understanding that they are not simply political parties in a peacetime democracy. They are communities of people who have bet on specific interpretations of the situation and specific visions of the future. The stakes are not abstract. They are about survival, about what kind of world the children of Nexus will grow up in, about whether humanity has a future beyond the underground, or whether the underground is the end of the story. The administrative authority of Nexus occupies a specific position in the factional landscape that is both inside and outside the factionalism. The administration is the formal governing structure of the city. It makes the decisions that keep the city running. It controls or claims to control the major resource flows, the security apparatus, the allocation of living space, and food and energy. Its legitimacy is based on necessity rather than consent. In the early days of the underground, someone had to make the decisions that kept people alive, and whoever made those decisions accrued authority that has been institutionalized over time. The administration's relationship to the other factions in Nexus is one of the ongoing tensions in the city's political life. Some factions see the administration as a legitimate, if imperfect, governing body that deserves support. Some see it as a necessary evil that provides stability at the cost of accountability. Some see it as a corrupt institution that has captured the city's resources for the benefit of its own members and their allies at the expense of the broader population. The truth, as the law suggests it, is probably some combination of all three, varying by context and by the specific decisions being made. The faction that is most directly interested in understanding the Ark, in accumulating knowledge about the machines and their objectives and their origin, has various names in different contexts, but is oriented around research as a value. The people who belong to this faction believe that knowledge of the Ark is the most important resource Nexus can accumulate, more important than food or materials or military capability, because without understanding the Ark, any other resource advantage is temporary. You cannot defeat an enemy you do not understand. You cannot negotiate with a force whose motivations you cannot read. You cannot plan for a future that involves the Ark without knowing what the Ark wants. The research faction's relationship to raiders is significant because raiders are the primary source of the empirical data that fuels research. Raiders encounter Ark machines directly. Raiders observe Ark behavior in the field. Raiders bring back machine fragments and environmental samples and found documents. The relationship between the research faction and the raider community is therefore one of mutual dependency, with researchers needing what raiders provide and raiders benefiting from the tactical and technical knowledge that research produces. The military faction, or the faction most explicitly focused on force as a response to the Ark, occupies a position in Nexus that is simultaneously central and frustrating. Central because Nexus cannot survive without security, both internal and against the potential for Ark incursion into the underground. Frustrating because the military approach to the Ark problem, the straightforward application of force to destroy Ark machines, has fundamental limits that the most capable military planners in Nexus are the first to acknowledge. You can kill machines. You cannot kill the orbital presence that keeps sending more machines. You cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy whose supply lines you cannot interrupt. The military faction therefore occupies a position of organizational importance and strategic stalemate. Its members are among the most capable people in Nexus for certain purposes. But the purpose it was formed to serve, defending humanity against the Ark through force of arms, is not fully achievable with the resources available and the strategic constraints that the orbital presence imposes. This creates internal tensions within the military faction, between those who advocate for aggressive surface operations as a demonstration of capability, and those who argue that measured, strategic engagement is the only viable approach given the limits of what force can accomplish. The economic faction, the group most focused on the management and growth of Nexus's material resources, is perhaps the most internally diverse of the major factions. It includes traders and manufacturers, and people who manage food production, and people who control access to specific materials. What unites them is a shared orientation toward the material fundamentals of Nexus survival. They are the people who think about whether the city will be able to feed itself next year, whether the energy systems will hold, whether the manufacturing capacity exists to maintain critical equipment. The economic faction's relationship to raiders is the most transactional of any faction. Raiders bring materials. The economic faction processes and allocates those materials. The price paid for raider finds, the priority given to specific surface missions, the allocation of resources to raider equipment, are all economic decisions that this faction has significant influence over. The tension between raiders who feel they are not adequately compensated for the risks they take, and economic faction representatives who argue that compensation is constrained by the city's overall resource situation, is one of the recurring social conflicts in Nexus. The humanitarian faction is perhaps the hardest to describe in straightforward ideological terms, because it is defined as much by what it opposes as by what it advocates. It opposes the use of people as means to institutional ends without regard for their well-being. It opposes resource allocation that systematically disadvantages the most vulnerable members of Nexus society. It advocates for policy decisions that account for human welfare as a genuine value rather than as a secondary consideration to efficiency or security. In a city organized primarily around survival, where hard choices are often justified as necessary for the good of all, the humanitarian faction is the persistent voice asking who is paying the price for those choices. The humanitarian faction's relationship to the raider profession is complex. On one hand, the raiders are among the most vulnerable members of Nexus society in terms of physical risk. On the other hand, raiders choose their profession and are generally not among the most economically disadvantaged members of the city's population. The humanitarian faction tends to be more focused on the people at the bottom of Nexus's internal hierarchy, the people who have the least choice about their circumstances, than on the raiders who at least have agency in the risks they take. The isolationist faction, those who believe that Nexus should focus entirely on internal sustainability and disengage as much as possible from surface operations and the associated risks, is a minority position, but one with genuine philosophical coherence. The isolationist argument is essentially this: every surface operation brings risk back to Nexus. Raiders get killed. Materials brought back might carry contaminants or risks not fully understood. The information gathered from the surface creates expectations and ambitions that exceed what Nexus can actually accomplish. Better to seal the city as fully as possible, to develop the most complete internal sustainability achievable, and to stop pretending that the surface is going to be reclaimed. The isolationist position is unpopular with most raiders for obvious reasons, and with the economic faction because Nexus's current level of material welfare genuinely depends on surface resources. But it has supporters in certain communities within Nexus, particularly among people who have lost family members to raider mortality and who see the surface as a place that takes more than it gives. The surface reclamation faction is in some ways the mirror image of the isolationists. Where the isolationists want to disengage from the surface entirely, the surface reclamation faction believes that the eventual goal of Nexus should be to return human beings to permanent surface habitation. Not in the immediate future, not without significant preparatory work, but as a strategic objective, as the thing that all other efforts should ultimately be oriented toward. The surface is the natural human environment. The underground is a refuge, not a destination, and a civilization that treats the underground as permanent is a civilization that has accepted defeat. The surface reclamation faction's relationship to raiders is enthusiastic. Raiders are the people who are on the surface, who know the surface, who are building the knowledge base and the operational infrastructure that any eventual return to surface habitation would require. From the reclamation faction's perspective, raiders are the vanguard of humanity's return, even if that return is generations away. The Ark Studies faction, those specifically dedicated to understanding the Ark machines and their purpose, overlaps with but is distinct from the broader research faction. The Ark Studies faction includes people who go beyond technical analysis of machine components and behavioral patterns to engage with the deeper questions of Ark motivation and Ark origin. These are people who spend time developing theories about what the Ark wants, about where it came from, about what its presence means in the largest possible frame. The Ark Studies faction is sometimes viewed with suspicion by other factions in Nexus, particularly by those who find the deeper theoretical questions irrelevant to immediate survival. Who cares where the Ark came from? We need to survive it now. The counter-argument from the Ark Studies perspective is that understanding what the Ark wants is essential to any long-term strategy for dealing with it. If you know what it wants, you know what it will stop when it has it. You know what you could potentially offer it to change its behavior. You know what you need to protect most urgently. Not knowing what it wants means operating blind strategically, no matter how good your tactical intelligence is. The spiritual factions within Nexus are worth noting, even though they do not have the same kind of institutional power as the economic or military factions. In the years since the fall, various forms of organized belief have developed within the city, some drawing on pre-fall religious traditions, some developing new frameworks specific to the post-fall situation. The arrival of the Ark has been interpreted in many ways across these different belief systems, some seeing it as a punishment or a test, some seeing it as an invitation to a new phase of human existence, some seeing it as a purely secular catastrophe that demands secular responses. The factional landscape of Nexus is not static. It has changed over the years as circumstances have changed, as generations have turned over, as specific events have shifted the balance of power and the relative credibility of different interpretations of the situation. The factions that exist now are not the same as the factions that existed when Nexus was first established, and they will not be the same in another 20 years. The political life of Nexus is a living thing, and understanding it requires understanding that its current form is a snapshot of an ongoing process rather than a settled state. The relationships between factions are not always adversarial. Some factions cooperate on specific issues where their interests align, even if they disagree on broader questions. Some factions have developed formal or informal alliances that persist across multiple issues. Some factional conflicts are primarily performative expressions of group identity rather than genuine disagreements about what should be done. And some conflicts are genuine and deep and represent real incompatibilities between how different groups of people understand the situation they are in. Raiders occupy an unusual position in Nexus's factional politics because they are simultaneously essential to multiple factions and attached to none of them in a simple way. Raiders are needed by the economic faction for the materials they bring back. They are needed by the military faction for the tactical intelligence they provide. They are needed by the research faction for the empirical data they gather. They are looked at as potential champions by the reclamation faction, and they are seen as the people most at risk by the humanitarian faction. No single faction owns the Raider identity, and Raiders tend to maintain a degree of factional independence that reflects both their individual autonomy and their awareness that their value is distributed across the political landscape rather than concentrated in one part of it. Chapter 11. The Surface Today. Zones, Hazards, and What Remains. The surface of Earth in the world of Ark Raiders is not a uniform wasteland. It is a complex and varied landscape that combines the ruins of the old world with the ongoing activity of the Ark machines and with the surprising resilience of the natural world in the absence of human habitation. Every surface zone that Raiders operate in has its own character, its own specific combination of hazards and resources, its own history and its own present. Understanding the surface, not just as an obstacle, but as a place, is part of what makes Ark Raiders' world feel real. The zones that Raiders access from Nexus represent a geographic sample of the surface, rather than the entirety of it. There is much more surface that Raiders do not access regularly, either because it is too distant, too dangerous, too thoroughly saturated with Ark activity, or simply not resource relevant enough to justify the risk. The zones that are accessible to Raiders are, in some sense, the known world of the surface. What lies beyond them is known only through the long-range observation that is possible from elevated surface positions and through historical knowledge about what those areas were in the old world. Industrial zones represent some of the most resource-rich but also most Ark-active areas on the surface. The machines have had a particular interest in industrial infrastructure since the fall, and the areas around factories, processing plants, and heavy manufacturing facilities are among the most consistently patrolled on the surface. The resources available in industrial zones are significant precisely because the Ark has been harvesting them systematically, which means the best materials are not lying around waiting to be picked up. They require navigating around Ark activity to get to them, which is exactly the kind of risk calculation that defines the Raider profession. Urban ruins are perhaps the most emotionally weighted zones on the surface. Walking through what was once a city, seeing the shells of buildings that once housed thousands of people, navigating streets that once carried traffic, encountering the personal remnants of lives that were interrupted, is an experience that Raiders describe in very different ways depending on their relationship to the old world. For those who remember the cities, it is a kind of grief. For those who grew up in Nexus and know the cities only as ruins, it is something more like archaeology. Both responses are present in Raider accounts of urban zones. The specific things Raiders find in urban ruins, the personal objects, the documents, the everyday items of the old world, are among the most informative pieces of Ark Raiders lore, because they are the most direct connection to what the old world was actually like. A grocery list found in an abandoned apartment, a child's homework left on a kitchen table, a half-finished letter that was never sent. These things are not the grand historical record of the fall. They are the ordinary record of ordinary lives, and they are more affecting for being ordinary. Former residential areas on the surface present a specific kind of navigational challenge, because the density of old structures creates complex sightlines and cover situations that affect how Ark machines move and how Raiders can move. The same urban density that once made cities feel alive now creates tactical environments that have to be read carefully. Ark machines that patrol residential areas have adapted to those environments in ways that take advantage of their specific geometry, and raiders who treat residential areas like open terrain make mistakes that experienced urban raiders do not. Agricultural land on the surface has undergone significant transformation in the years since the fall. In some areas, fields that were once farmland have been partially overtaken by Ark machine activity that seems to be extracting specific soil components or processing organic material. In other areas, particularly those not in heavily Ark-trafficked zones, vegetation has returned and in some cases flourished in ways that reflect what happens to land when human management stops and natural processes resume. These areas are sometimes described by raiders as the most alive parts of the surface, places where the natural world is doing what it does without either human cultivation or Ark interference. Water environments on the surface, rivers, lakes, coastal areas, present raiders with specific sets of conditions and specific sets of resources. Watercourses can serve as navigation aids, as sources of fresh water with appropriate treatment, and as transit routes that Ark machines sometimes cannot follow effectively. They can also be hazards, both in the obvious physical sense and because certain Ark machine types seem to have specific operational patterns around water bodies that are different from their inland behaviour. The relationship between Ark machines and surface water is one of the behavioural patterns that Nexus researchers find most suggestive in terms of what it might tell them about Ark resource priorities. Elevated terrain, hills, ridges, and high points on the surface have tactical value for raiders because of the observation advantages they provide. From elevated positions, raiders can survey larger areas, track machine patrol patterns, assess the relative density of Ark activity across zones, and plan routes that minimize exposure. The Ark machines are aware of this tactical value and patrol elevated terrain more aggressively than some lower areas, which creates a specific risk-reward dynamic around high ground. Forest zones and areas with significant tree cover have changed substantially in the years since the fall. Human forestry management has stopped. The trees that survived the initial period of Ark activity have grown in patterns that reflect natural succession rather than managed harvesting. Dense forest cover creates environments where radar and optical detection, whether by Ark machines or by raiders, is more limited, which creates tactical opportunities for raiders who know how to move through forested terrain. It also creates environments where ambush is more possible in both directions. The structural integrity of old-world buildings in the surface zones is highly variable and something raiders learn to assess constantly. Buildings that look stable from outside may not be structurally sound after years of Ark machine vibration, weathering without maintenance, and physical damage from fall-era events. Entering old structures is one of the consistent risks of surface operation, and the decision about whether a given building is safe enough to enter is one that raiders make rapidly and with consequences attached. The roads and transportation networks that connected the old world persist on the surface in various states of decay and modification. Some roads remain partially functional as transit routes, though they are obviously not maintained and have suffered years of weathering and Ark machine traffic. Others have been modified by Ark activity in ways that make them either unusable for human travel or useful for specific tactical purposes. Rail infrastructure, where it exists, is similarly variable in its current state. Areas of specific historical significance in the old world, locations that held cultural or institutional importance, are present in the surface zones and carry a different kind of weight than the generic ruins. A museum that once housed artifacts of human history, now empty of its collections and occupied by Ark machines. A government building that once housed the institutions of a nation-state, now a broken shell in the ruins of a city. These places are not just ruins, they are specific reminders of specific things that were lost. The presence of human remains on the surface is something the law treats with appropriate gravity, People died on the surface during the fall and in the years since. Their remains are part of the landscape. How raiders deal with this reality, how they manage the psychological weight of it, and the practical and ethical questions around how to treat human remains found on the surface are dimensions of raider experience that the game acknowledges without making the central focus of every surface encounter. Ark machine debris fields, areas where machine remains from destroyed units have accumulated, are among the more distinctive and informative locations on the surface. The composition of what is in a debris field, the types of machines destroyed there, the evidence of what kind of engagement produced the damage, and the materials that can be salvaged from the remains, all of it tells stories about what has happened in that area. Some debris fields are old, remnants of early fall engagement. Some are recent, evidence of ongoing raider activity. Reading a debris field is one of the skills that distinguishes experienced raiders from newer ones. Weather on the surface in the post-fall world is an ongoing research topic in Nexus, because it is not entirely clear whether the surface weather patterns that now exist are simply what natural weather would be in the absence of the human activity that modified it before the fall, or whether Ark machine activity is affecting atmospheric conditions in ways that change the weather. Certain unusual meteorological patterns that have been observed repeatedly in areas of high Ark activity have prompted the second hypothesis. If the Ark is affecting the atmosphere, the implications for long-term surface habitability are significant. Day and night cycles on the surface are a basic environmental parameter that raiders need to manage operationally. Ark machine behavior does not always change significantly between day and night, but visibility conditions change drastically. Night operations on the surface have specific advantages and specific dangers. Certain machine types appear to have enhanced low-light capability. Others are, based on raider observation, somewhat less effective in darkness. Managing the day-night cycle as an operational variable is one of the tactical considerations that surface planning accounts for. The sounds of the surface are one of its most distinctive characteristics compared to the underground. The open acoustic environment, the wind, the sounds of wildlife that has returned, the ambient mechanical noise of Ark machines at various distances, all of it creates a soundscape that is simultaneously alien to Nexus residents and alive in ways that the underground is not. Raiders who have spent significant time on the surface often describe the sounds as one of the things that mark the experience as qualitatively different from anything in Nexus. Landmarks on the surface serve as navigation aids for raiders who have learned them. Specific structures, geographic features, Ark machine installations, all of them used as reference points for surface navigation in the absence of the GPS and communication infrastructure that the old world relied on. The mental map of a surface zone that an experienced raider carries is one of their most valuable practical assets, and it is built up over many runs through careful observation and spatial memory. The Ark installations on the surface, the structures that the machines have built or significantly modified to serve their own purposes, are among the most significant and most dangerous locations raiders can encounter. These installations vary in scale from small processing sites to large structures whose purpose is not fully understood. The relationship between different Ark installation types, which ones are most central to Ark surface operations, which ones are most peripheral, is a map that Nexus researchers are still filling in with the data that raiders provide. The sensory experience of the surface for someone coming up from Nexus for the first time is something the lore depicts as overwhelming. The scale of the open sky, which no amount of description fully prepares you for when you have spent your life underground. The quality of the light, filtered through the atmosphere rather than generated by artificial sources. The temperature variation across the day, which is much more dramatic than anything inside Nexus. The sounds, the smells, the physical reality of open terrain. First-time raiders invariably report that the surface is both more and less what they expected, that it confirms some things and overturns others. The surface at its most elemental, stripped of the specific content of Ark machines and old-world ruins, is just Earth. The planet that humans evolved on, that humans have lived on for hundreds of thousands of years. The same gravity, the same atmosphere, breathable without equipment, as long as you're in the right locations. The same basic physical reality. Raiders who spend time thinking about this observation sometimes arrive at a kind of quiet fury at the fact that this world, this planet, which is the natural home of human beings, is currently occupied by something else, and that humans are living underground in it. That fury, quiet as it usually is in how the lore presents it, is one of the motivating energies of the Raider experience. Not just the economic motivation, not just the survival necessity, but something more personal and more political. The surface belongs to humans in some fundamental sense that has nothing to do with formal property rights. And the experience of being on it, however dangerous and however carefully managed the experience has to be, is a reminder of that belonging. Chapter 12. Technology in the Post-Fall World. Human Innovation. Under constraint. The technology available to the people of Nexus and to the raiders who operate on the surface is one of the most practically interesting dimensions of Ark Raiders' world. It is technology produced by a civilization that has been cut off from most of its pre-fall technological base and forced to innovate within very tight material and knowledge constraints. What that technology looks like, how it relates to what came before, and what the most significant technological developments in the post-fall world have been, are all questions the lore engages with through the equipment raiders use and the infrastructure of Nexus itself. The most fundamental technological challenge of Nexus is the maintenance and operation of its life support systems. The air processing, water treatment, food production, and energy generation systems that keep the underground city alive are the top priority for the city's engineering talent, and the work of maintaining them is continuous and demanding. Much of the technical knowledge in Nexus is oriented toward these systems, toward keeping them running with available materials, and toward improving them to increase the city's margin of safety. The weapons technology used by raiders represents one of the areas where post-fall innovation has been most necessary and most creative. The weapons available to raiders are not simply the weapons of the old world, preserved and maintained. Some of them are where old world weapons can be salvaged and kept operational, but many of them have been modified or designed specifically to be effective against Ark machines. Using knowledge of Ark machine vulnerability points that has been developed over years of trial and error and research, the relationship between raider weapons and Ark machine materials is one of the more interesting technological feedback loops in the game's world. Certain Ark materials, when incorporated into raider equipment, produce capabilities that standard human materials cannot. This creates a situation where the machines that raiders fight are also, in a sense, the source of the best equipment for fighting them. The technological incentive for raiders to engage Ark machines and to bring back their remains is not just economic, it is also the path to better equipment. Armor technology for raiders represents another area of active development. The challenge of producing protective equipment that is light enough for surface mobility while offering meaningful protection against Ark machine attacks is one that Nexus engineers have been working on since the earliest days of organized surface operations. The solutions that have been developed reflect the material constraints of the post-fall world, using available materials in creative combinations and configurations. Communication technology for surface operations is one of the areas where the fall created the most significant setbacks. The global communication infrastructure of the old world is gone, and rebuilding anything comparable is far beyond Nexus's current capacity. What exists for raider communication is improvised and short-range by the standards of the old world, effective for coordinating teams in the field but not for maintaining contact with Nexus during surface operations in distant zones. The medical technology available in Nexus is one of the areas where the post-fall world most painfully reflects what was lost. The sophisticated medical capabilities of the old world required not just knowledge, but supply chains, manufacturing capacity, and specialized equipment that no longer exists. What Nexus has is improvised and creative, the product of medical professionals who have had to find solutions to the same problems that old world medicine solved, but with a fraction of the resources and infrastructure. Agricultural technology in Nexus is one of the areas of the most impressive post-fall innovation. Growing food underground, at scale, efficiently enough to feed a large population, is not something that pre-fall agriculture was designed to do. The techniques that Nexus uses are adaptations and innovations developed through hard experience and scientific knowledge that the city has carefully preserved and extended. Energy technology represents one of the more complex technological challenges of the post-fall world. The city needs power. The power sources available are limited. The knowledge to build new power generation systems exists in the technical expertise of Nexus engineers, but the materials required are not always accessible. Surface operations that target energy-relevant resources are therefore among the highest priority Raider missions from the city's administrative perspective. Manufacturing capability in Nexus is a subject the law treats with a mixture of pride and frustration. The city can make things. It has machining capability, fabrication capacity, material processing. But everything is constrained by what materials can be sourced and what energy can be devoted to manufacturing, which means that the menu of things that can be made in useful quantities is limited. The relationship between Raider surface operations and Nexus manufacturing is a direct one. What Raiders bring back determines in significant part what Nexus can make. Computing technology in the post-fall world is one of the areas where the distance from the old world is most acute. The information processing capabilities of the pre-fall world, from personal devices to institutional computing infrastructure, simply do not exist in any comparable form in Nexus. The city has computing capability, preserved and maintained from pre-fall technology, where possible, and supplemented by whatever can be constructed from available components, but it is not comparable to what existed before. The analysis of Ark technology is simultaneously one of the most challenging and most rewarding areas of Nexus research. Challenging because Ark technology operates on principles that human science has not fully mapped. Rewarding because every advance in understanding Ark technology produces insights that have practical applications for Nexus manufacturing and for Raider equipment. The knowledge gained from studying Ark machine fragments has already produced applications in Nexus technology. It has also produced questions that have not yet been answered. Optical and sensory technology for Raiders, the equipment that allows them to observe and navigate the surface more effectively, is another area of active development. Long-range observation, detection of Ark machine presence at safe distances, imaging in conditions of poor visibility, all of it represents capabilities that directly affect Raider survival rates. The development of better sensing equipment has been one of the consistent priorities of Nexus technical research since the earliest days of surface operations. Navigation technology on the surface, in the absence of GPS and other pre-fall navigation aids, relies on dead reckoning, landmark recognition, and the manual interpretation of surface features. Experienced Raiders carry mental maps of the zones they operate in that are extremely detailed and reliable within their scope. Maps of the surface, produced through the accumulated observations of Raiders over years, are valuable documents in Nexus and are carefully maintained and updated as conditions on the surface change. The technology of Ark machine behavior prediction is one of the more esoteric areas of Nexus research, but one with direct practical applications for raider safety. If you can predict where a machine will be and what it will do, you can plan your movement around it more effectively. The development of predictive models for Ark behavior, based on observed patterns and on whatever understanding of Ark machine logic has been developed, is an ongoing project that feeds directly into the practical knowledge raiders use on the surface. Materials science in Nexus is one of the areas where the intersection of old world knowledge and new world materials has produced genuine innovation. The materials available in the post-fall world are not always the same as the materials that pre-fall industrial processes were optimized for. Working with what is available, finding ways to process and combine surface materials into useful forms has required creative application of materials science principles in novel contexts. The preservation of pre-fall technical knowledge is one of the ongoing projects of Nexus institutions. Technical documents, engineering manuals, scientific references, all of the knowledge base of the old world that relates to practical problems that Nexus faces is preserved, copied, and taught. The knowledge that made it into the underground at the time of the fall, and the knowledge that has been salvaged from surface sources since, forms the intellectual foundation on which Nexus technical culture is built. Biotechnology in Nexus is present in a limited form, focused primarily on agricultural applications and on medical research. The pre-fall world had sophisticated biotechnology that was deployed for many purposes, and some of the knowledge from that tradition has been preserved in Nexus. The application of that knowledge is constrained by material limits, but it has produced results in areas like accelerated plant growth, biological processing of waste, and the development of treatments for specific medical conditions using biological rather than pharmaceutical approaches. The technology of Nexus's defensive systems, the mechanisms by which the underground city is protected against the possibility of Ark machine intrusion, is one of the most carefully maintained and most sensitive areas of city infrastructure. The exact nature of those defenses is not fully described in the law, which itself is significant. The administration's caution about sharing information about Nexus defenses reflects both the practical concern about that information reaching the wrong entities and the political concern about public understanding of how secure or insecure the city actually is. The Ark's own technology, insofar as it can be understood and potentially adapted, represents the most significant technological wildcard in the post-fall world. The machines are constructed with engineering principles and from materials that exceed current human manufacturing capability, but they are not incomprehensible. They can be analysed, they can be partially understood, and over time some of what is understood about them can be incorporated into human technology. The pace of that incorporation and the degree to which it changes the balance of capability between humans and Ark machines is one of the variables that makes the long-term future of Nexus genuinely open. Chapter 13. The language of ruins, how the surface tells its story. The surface zones of Ark Raiders are not simply combat environments or resource locations. They are texts full of information about what happened there and why. Learning to read the surface to decode the story that the ruins tell is one of the skills that transforms a raider from someone who moves through a space to someone who understands it. And understanding the surface is not just tactically valuable, it is emotionally and intellectually valuable in ways that the game's lore takes seriously. Every zone on the surface has a history that predates the fall, and a history that began with the fall and continues to the present. The pre-fall history is visible in the structure and layout of what was built there, in the materials used, in the design choices made by the people who planned and built the space. The post-fall history is visible in the patterns of destruction and modification, in the Ark machine infrastructure that has been added, in the way the natural world has reclaimed certain spaces, and in the way Ark activity has prevented reclamation in others. Reading the pre-fall history of a surface zone gives raiders and researchers information about what resources were present before the Ark arrived, what infrastructure exists that might still be intact or accessible, and what the social and economic function of the area was. A zone that was once a medical facility has a different resource profile from a zone that was once a manufacturing plant. Understanding what a zone was helps you understand what might still be there and how it might be relevant to Nexus needs. Reading the post-fall history of a zone tells you about the Ark's activity there, which areas the machines have concentrated their work in, what they have taken and what they have left, how the machine presence has changed the physical space. This history is written in the evidence of machine activity, in cleared areas where materials have been removed, in modified structures where machines have made changes for their own operational purposes, in the patrol patterns that reflect the current priorities of Ark operations in that zone. The stratigraphy of ruin, the layering of different periods of change visible in the physical structure of the surface, is something raiders who pay attention can read as a timeline. Earlier fall era damage, different in character from later Ark modification, different again from weather and natural decay. Reading those layers tells you about the sequence of events, about what happened first and what came later, and sometimes about why. Documents found on the surface are one of the most direct forms of information that the lore provides, and the game treats them as primary sources in the fullest sense. They are imperfect, incomplete, written by people who did not know how the story would end, and who did not intend their words to be read by anyone in the present. But they are genuine records of genuine experience, and they contain information about the fall and about the pre-fall world that cannot be obtained any other way. The physical state of documents found on the surface is itself informative. Documents that have been protected from the elements, stored in sealed containers, or preserved by specific environmental conditions may be in readable condition. Documents that have been exposed to moisture, to the vibration of Ark machine activity, to fire or chemical contamination, may be partially or entirely degraded. The information that can be recovered from damaged documents is sometimes significant and sometimes frustratingly incomplete, which mirrors the way historical knowledge always works. The distribution of finds on the surface, what kinds of objects and documents are found in what kinds of locations, reflects the social and economic structure of the pre-fall world. High-value materials and important documents were not randomly distributed. They were in specific places for specific reasons. A raider who understands how the old world organized itself can predict more accurately where specific kinds of finds are likely to be. Environmental storytelling in the surface zones, the deliberate placement of objects, and evidence to suggest specific events and histories without explicit narration, is one of the design choices in Ark Raiders that serves the lore depth most effectively. A room where furniture has been pushed against a door, a vehicle that ran out of fuel mid-route, a shelter where someone clearly lived for an extended period after the fall, and then stopped. These environmental stories require no explanation. They speak for themselves to anyone paying attention. The evidence of human resistance to Ark machines during and after the fall is present in the surface zones in forms that tell specific stories of specific engagements. Fortified positions, expended ammunition, the remains of improvised weapons and defences. These are the physical records of humans fighting back against the machines, of efforts that were ultimately unsuccessful in the macro sense, but that represent individual and collective acts of resistance that the lore treats with genuine respect. The evidence of people helping each other during the fall is also present in the surface zones, and it is easy to miss if you are only looking for the dramatic. The improvised medical supplies left near shelter areas, the food caches organised in ways that suggest sharing rather than hoarding, the notes left to guide others to safety, the evidence of organised care in chaotic conditions. These signs of collective human decency in extremity are part of the surface's story, and they provide a different kind of emotional balance to the evidence of destruction and loss. The Ark's own record-keeping on the surface is visible in certain locations in forms that humans can observe but not easily read. Ark structures that seem to have data storage functions, patterns of machine activity that seem to follow logistical records of some kind. The physical evidence of Ark operations that suggests they are organised according to some plan or schedule. Reading the Ark's record, to whatever extent it is readable, is one of the most ambitious goals of Nexus surface research, because it might reveal what the Ark is actually trying to accomplish. The testimony of the surface, taken as a whole, is simultaneously an indictment and an inspiration. An indictment of a world that was too fragile, too dependent on complex systems, too unprepared for a shock of the magnitude the Ark delivered, and an inspiration in the evidence of human resilience, human creativity, human decency that persisted in the most extreme conditions. The surface tells both stories, and the raiders who hear them carry both in the work they do. Chapter 14: Individual Stories. The human face of the lore. The large-scale narrative of Ark Raiders, the fall of civilization, and the survival of Nexus, and the mystery of the Ark is told through the accumulated weight of individual stories. Not just the backstories of the playable characters, though those are significant, but the stories that emerge from found documents, from things characters say in passing, from the environmental evidence of specific lives that were interrupted or ended by the events the game depicts. The logistics manager, whose last pre-fall work order was for materials that never arrived. The soldier who wrote a letter home that was never sent. The parent who recorded the milestones of a child's early life in a journal that the Arky's arrival interrupted. The researcher who was writing notes for a paper that would have been submitted to a scientific conference that no longer exists. These are not central characters. They are not named characters in the game's story, but they are real in the way that the game constructs them. Real enough that encountering their remnants on the surface lands with genuine emotional weight. The diversity of those individual stories, the range of people and lives and perspectives that they represent, is one of the things that gives Ark Raiders' world its texture. The game does not tell you that the old world was full of varied human experience. It shows you that, through the variety of the specific individual traces it leaves in the ruins. The stories that continue in the present, the lives being lived in Nexus and on the surface, are told through the characters who speak and act in the game's current timeline. Each of those characters is carrying something, a specific history and a specific relationship to that history, and the complexity of those characters is one of the things that makes the game's world feel inhabited rather than staged. The Raiders themselves, as a community of individuals, represent a cross-section of post-fall humanity. Each one has a reason for being who they are, for being where they are, for doing what they do. The variety of those reasons, and the variety of the people who carry them, is part of what makes the Raider community interesting as a subject of narrative attention. The unheard stories are also part of the lore's texture. The stories that are implied but not told. The people who did not make it to Nexus. The communities that established underground refuges and did not survive. The resistance groups on the surface whose fate is not documented in any found material. The presence of those untold stories, the awareness of them even without access to their content, is one of the ways the lore communicates the scale of what the fall cost. Chapter 15: The Deep Lore.